And I'm just gonna double check all of our channels to make sure everything.
Are we going live? Hey everyone, hope you're doing well out there. I've got my new mic set up. If it starts to crackle, if anything goes wrong, tell us immediately in the comments and I will panic.
I was waiting for your reveal of tech genius of how you're gonna solve the issue.
I'd like to thank Blue TARDIS, if he happens to be out there, for helping me get my tech up and running.
Okay, we're all set to start. Everything's working, so great. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another week of Lorebeards. And this is the first week where we actually opened up voting for the community to decide. And we had the choices of talking about one of my favorite conspiracies, which is the triple goddess theory, which is something we'll probably get around to a later day. Nagash, and then an Empire QA, and Nagash won, though it actually near the end was getting kind of close between the elf goddesses and Nagash. But Nagash did come out on top. There was almost 4,000 votes, I think, which is pretty awesome. So we wanted to thank everybody for participating in that. And do let us know, by the way, as well, if the audio levels are good and everything. Make sure y'all let me know if you can hear Andy well. And let's just jump into it. So I'm going to go ahead and preface this before we even start. We did read this. We did. Me and Andy both read through The Rise of Nagash. Not going to talk about it. That's all I'm going to say. It is not relevant to this conversation.
I'd like to also thank Mr. Vaughan for pointing out the N7 hoodie. I do indeed like it. So I have a couple of comments to open up with as well. And that's that Nagash has gone through various versions over the course of time. When you go back to when he was first introduced in 4th, all the way up to what they did with him in the end times, each of which draws upon different sources. So you're going to find that as we go along, we're not going to so much contradict ourselves here, but we are going to occasionally say, in this book it says this, and in that book, it says that, or alternatively, there's just different stories here. And it's going to be a matter of which one that we plumb down on a particular comment thread that we'll eventually come to some form of answer with. Particularly with, is Nagash alive and good to go right now? According to the end times, no. But according to the end times, yes.
Yeah, well, hey, that's always the... That's always the joy of Warhammer Fantasy or anything Games Workshop related, is that technically everything is correct and also nothing.
Absolutely. So you're going to find a little bit of self-contradictory nonsense as we go along, but that's part of the fun.
Yeah, that's half the ride. Yeah. That's what, and I will say that's what makes Lord's discussions really interesting and possible for this, is that you can literally have an endless discussion because you can argue and everyone can be right.
Totally.
So, Nagash, the Great Necromancer, one of my favorite characters, and a character that has honestly only gotten better with time, at least in my opinion. I'm not sure exactly, like, he goes pretty far back as far as like Warhammer Fantasy is concerned. I mean, he's had a...
Tell you when he first entered the
I'll just let you take over for the intro.
Yeah, okay. So let's start at the very beginning. It's a pretty good place to begin. So back in 1994, Nagash was first entered into the great world of Warhammer with the Undead Army List. Now, the Undead Army List for 4th edition Warhammer was quite unlike the army list that we get later, in that it was an army list for all undead, not just Tomb Kings or vampires or something that lay in between. It was very much this is the undead, and these are all the things that you get with an undead army. And Nagash was introduced there for the very first time, as was descriptions for the land of the dead and how they work. And believe it or not, the character has changed almost nothing from its 4th edition intro. It's been given a lot more extra material over the course of time as they've drilled down on specific details that may never have been covered to begin with, but the core of the character has stayed the same from there. So if you're out there going, I'd really like to see where this all started, I'd recommend the 1994 Undead Army List. However, I don't think it's the best place to begin if we're going to be discussing Nagash. The best place to begin is actually the modern, the good old current, in terms of 8th Warhammer, Tomb King army list, because there we get arguably the most important influencer for starting the conversation about Nagash, and that's the mortuary cult and where it comes from. And ultimately, Nagash's creator, Cetra.
Yeah, which love Cetra. Awesome guy. I cannot wait to see his new mini for the old world because he was really big in the advertising when they announced it. which that was weird seeing Games Workshop make memes, but whatever works.
Certainly made me smile.
Yeah, their marketing team was like, let's let the young person handle the marketing announcement. But yeah, so Cetra, the only person I would argue is as arrogant or maybe even more arrogant than Nagash. It's a tight race between the two of them, and I think they're both aware of that, which is why they hate each other. But
so to start off the loose discussion there, Cetra, he was, let's say, the biggest Tomb King in the past who bound all together and battled with, he took the original Khemri city, which was originally founded by Nehek, which is where Nehekara gets its name from. And he pretty much bound all of that, plus pretty much everything up to the Empire, across the mountains and all the way over up into what is now known as Deep Chaos Dwarf territory, all the way down into Southlands and battling away with lizardmen, and he made that his empire. And his greatest regret was that he would not live to expand it further. Indeed, there's a nice little story with him as he makes his way all the way up to what is the modern day Black Mountains. He gets there and he's like, oh yeah, I've conquered right up to the edge of the world, crosses over what becomes Blackfire Pass, reaches the other side and goes, holy shit, there's more world. And gets really depressed because he's not going to make it. He's already old by this point. And that's what starts the mortuary cult. He founds it. He says, no, we've got to find a way to extend our lives. We have got access to the gods. And as they move forward, their understandings of the winds of magic, particularly with the gods, began to modify as well. Because the further north they went, the more the winds of magic, which they believed was the breath of the gods themselves, became evident to them. So as they make their way all the way back to what will become the land of the dead, they just call it, what is it, the promised land or the blessed land? I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, the blessed land, I think is
blessed land. It could be, yeah. So they retreat back there, and the mortuary cult is founded, and they have one job only: immortality. That's it. And they study like mad.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that Cetra got a whole multi-hours video if anyone's bored and wants to go watch that on him, that I'm very proud of. But Cetra is definitely one of the most fascinating figures in Warhammer history, of that you take a guy who in many ways was kind of started as a regular human, and he took humanity to kind of its ultimate limit. Like Andy said, his empire was fucking gigantic. I think it was bigger than Cathay at its largest.
Yeah, I'd say it's probably the biggest one that we're aware of in the world, possibly barring the elves, because the elves at their peak were pretty much all over the world. Lizardmen don't really count.
They cheated being a naval empire.
Yeah, I mean, they did the British Empire thing. The sun never sets in our empire. That tiny bit there, that tiny bit there, that tiny bit there. Oh yeah, we rule the world.
Yeah. And Cetra, Cetra was so powerful that he was able to get the Nehekaran gods to basically almost be unequal to him, as opposed to him like actively worshiping. Like, he worshipped them, but he also did some pretty nasty stuff to make some interesting deals with them.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that Cetra came to power is that he didn't do what the previous, let's say, Nehekaran, although they weren't really Nehekaran peoples per se at that point. But he did what the previous kings didn't do, and that's what he actually revered and put gods front and center, and was constantly using them, not just to reinforce his own, let's say, as a force multiplier, but he was also using it as a people modifier to make everybody band together underneath one belief system, the belief system of their gods. And they created supposedly a great covenant with the gods. They believed themselves to be given all of their knowledge from the gods. Their beliefs say that the gods fought against the great wars against chaos and pushed them north from what is now the lands of the dead and fertilized the entire area around the great river Vitae, which is interestingly classical in terms of language and creates all manner of questions as to the nature of language. But let's not think about that, because it just means life in the classical language. So the river Vitae, and the gods filled that with life. And then the Nehekarans were given access to all the technology that was required and all of the holy stuff that was required to make life there. And Cetra was the one that reground everybody back and said, these gods, they're the shiz, and these gods are the ones that are going to allow me, Captain Megalomaniac, to conquer the world.
Yeah, and to be fair, he wasn't blowing smoke. Like, he made a from our modern perspective, a horrible sacrifice. He butchered his entire family in offering to the gods, but he basically reinvigorated that pact. Like, because of that, there was a horrible plague affecting like Khemri especially, but a lot of Nehekara, and the gods brought the rain, and the rain washed the plague away, and the Vitae flooded and got rid of all this ruination because the gods were very happy. And Cetra rose to power, and then he ran around kicking the crap out of all the other cities and telling them they were his now. And
so the next step for me is the mortuary cult.
Yes.
Now this one's big because from Cetra's rule to the point when Cetra eventually dies, we have 5 generations worth of mortuary cult in place, and each generation learned more and increasingly more about extending life. Now, the important thing here is to really realize that this isn't necessarily about necromancy per se, but it becomes about necromancy. In that, to begin with, they're all about extending life, using rituals, using various techniques, using various religious ceremonies to extend their life to make it last longer. And Cetra himself has this done to him, and he lives for a very, very long time.
Yeah,
like
the first goal was not. Yeah, the first goal, because a lot of people think Tomb Kings and they think, oh, like bringing back people from the dead. The first goal was not to die in the first place.
Yeah, 100%. And then when they realized, the mortuary cult, that they couldn't get him to live any longer, they basically had to break the news to Cetra, who was known for his somewhat, let's say, tetchy nature. Dude, you're gonna die. I'm really sorry, but we as the mortuary cult think we can do something. We can bind your soul directly into your body so that you will never truly die, and we'll be able to bring you back later. That's the plan. And in that process, the priests in turn figure out how to do it for themselves, and they move from being priests into like priests. And this is before Nagash. So make sure you're aware of this when you're thinking about exactly where does the undead stuff comes from. It doesn't really come, strictly speaking, from Nagash. Nagash was standing on the shoulders of previous research that was already done because Cetra commanded it to be so. Cetra, in many respects, creates the entire environment that Nagash is born into, where we've got ourselves like priests who can live for centuries. And they are secretly guarding the information and knowledge that they have because they don't want to lose the power they have. The kings, who they extend the life for often centuries in turn, will carry on until eventually they die of an equivalent of old age, where the like priests just don't die. They just keep going, but there is a downside because they haven't found the secret to eternal youth.
Yeah,
they found the secret to eternal life. And that means that they get older and older and older until
a lot of people
become liches.
A lot of people look at lich priests and are like, wow, look at this undead unit. It's like, technically, they're not. They're actually still alive.
Yeah, technically, they're just sort of still going. And the like priests just keep on going. And they're arguably the first undead, but it is deeply arguable because I think be fair to say, in terms of Warhammer's overall cosmology, the first true undead come because of Nagash's actions. But he is born into this priesthood, in that he's the firstborn son of one of the kings, which means he immediately goes into the mortuary cult, and his younger brother becomes the king after him. And Nagash is surrounded by these ancient mysteries that have been put in place by Cetra, who is absolutely obsessed with living forever. And the people themselves, by the time Nagash has come round, are so obsessed with the nature of life and death that their entire culture has become centered around it. The god of death, in many respects, is now far more important than the king of the gods itself. Skulls and bones are all over the lands of what will become the lands of the dead, because it's become such a central part of their religion about their cosmology. And Nagash himself is equally obsessed, but with one extra detail: he's also brilliant.
Yeah, and there are a few little things that are introduced in the later lore that I like a lot. Like, we do have one note of one of the things that really inspires Nagash from an early age. And like Andy said, he was handed to the mortuary cult very early. of that because the mortuary cult was so important, because the Cetra cared more about the mortuary cult for his own selfish reasons, because he told them when he was dying, y'all better bring me back or else. And he had enough power and was liked enough by the gods that even though the priest could theoretically live forever, that was terrifying to them. Nobody wanted to fail Cetra because even in death, he was terrifying. So they figure out, like Andy said, but when Nagash is born, because the firstborns are always handed over to the mortuary cult, make sure the mortuary cult has a lot of power and wields a lot of power over the royal families. Nagash, one of the notes we get about him is that early in the mortuary cult, because he has to study death and understand how death works and everything, he witnesses people die. And Nagash, he watches people die, and the first big thought that occurs to him as a child is he looks at it and he goes, not for me.
Yep.
I refuse to experience this. It looks horrible.
He's wrong, because he will.
Yeah. And I think in a lot of ways he was scared of it. Like Nagash honestly comes off as a character who, although he hides it well, he is terrified of death. Which
I definitely think that's the case to begin with. When he becomes what he eventually becomes, the concept of terror is largely gone, but that doesn't mean that it's not still embedded into his psyche in terms of how he works and progresses through all of the choices that he makes.
Yeah. So like Andy said, he's brilliant. He comes up in the mortuary cult's ranks, and like Andy said, I mean, he's working with people who are functionally immortal and have been around for like Grand Hierophant Katep, who's one of the oldest I think the oldest Lich Priest.
Yep, he's the oldest we know of, at least.
Yeah, one of the originals that really figured out immortality. Nagash is so freaking intelligent, and he's able to process information and knowledge and understand like a lot of the cults. The mortuary cult had a very different understanding of magic back then. Like Andy said, they relied much more on their religion to inflict work with the winds of magic, and they didn't have access to as much magic.
Yeah.
So they relied very heavily on that relationship with the gods, and Nagash kind of learned everything they had to teach him while just in the span of becoming an adult. Like he wasn't that old when he reached the point where he was kind of on par with the likes of Katep and them as far as understanding the nature of everything they did know. And Nagash realized that their knowledge was limited, and it frustrated him immensely.
So, at the mighty age of 32, that's about to change completely. So, we're now talking, well, Nagash was born approximately 4,500 years before let's say, the current era, the end of the world, whichever particular era you're working in, 25, something or another, an imperial calendar. And when he's 32, he gets access to some dark elves. And now there's different stories here. In fact, I've read at least 3 different stories for how this particular event pans out. In some of them, it's when his dad dies. They were captured and put in his pyramid, and they were tortured. In other ones, he actually works with them. In others, he has them captured and they're utilized almost like slaves for a while and then turned into his teachers in dark magic. There's a variety of different versions, but ultimately, at some point, 3 dark elves, and this is where it gets a little bit dodgy when you start trying to think about it in practice. 3 exceedingly powerful dark elf sorcerers somehow get captured. Now, that in and of itself is super fascinating. How? But regardless of the how, they are then somehow persuaded by Nagash, or alternatively others who are working with Nagash, to teach him dark magic. And that in and of itself is also super interesting. But even more interesting on top of that, these are also elves who must know at least enough about certain applications of dark magic that they are aware of, for example, how souls work. They are aware of the potential extending geriatric side to magic use as well, because we already know by this point, Malekith has already mastered this, as has Marathi. So we're looking at someone that is possibly related to that. And here's another one. One of them's probably male. And for those of you who know your male and your female dark elf sorcerers, there's that whole story there too.
Yeah. And you know, a lot of this we've talked about kind of in prior weeks, which actually led up to this very nicely. Now I think about it, we didn't do it on purpose, but it feels like we did it on purpose. With like back when we talked about Malekith, and also when we talked about the Winds of Magic last week, of that the Dark Elves had some what you could call necromancy in a sense, where like the city of Haggrave has like wailing spirits and stuff flying around the spires, and they have a very they don't view mortality in the same way that humans do. They don't have that obsession that the Nehakarans do, because to them it's kind of it's so, you know, it's like an ant trying to extend another day when you live for 100 years. It's just not something you think about. It's not something, and for the Dark Elves, it's a lot more of a simple understanding system, something they've already figured out. They've already found a satisfying answer to that issue. But for humans, those answers don't work as well.
Yeah. And it's also worth saying that the Dark Elves who figured it out jealously guard it, because if it was so prevalently known, Hellebron wouldn't be in the position that she's currently in, for
Poor
example.
Hellebron.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, what she has is a pretty sucky situation.
She's basically a Dark Elf Lich Priest.
Yeah, pretty much. And if Marathi just gave her the stuff, stuff that very possibly is getting passed over to Nagash at this early point, at least in some form or another, or he figures out the rest of it, then things would be very different over in Dark Elf land. But anyway, good old Nagash gets access to dark magic through one method or another and learns it super fast. I do mean super fast. Most of the chronologies around this area generally knock it at not more than 10 years that he has. And most of the versions of it have Nagash torturing them to get hold of it. Although if you go to the novels, that's not really the case. They basically have a nice little chat.
The novels can stuff it, because
it's quite a different version.
Maybe in like the last 10 minutes we'll talk about the novels, but we're not doing that right now.
Yeah, we really don't want to, because it's so very different if you look at how the novels handled it. But the general story is 3 Dark Elves, probably one of them male. The best story around the back of it, given that one of them is male, is that they could be renegades that have nowhere else to go. And they choose to stay there. They choose to help Nagash. And I say choose on purpose because regardless of the supposed torture, they do not have enough magic to stop what is the equivalent of Teclis, Yurtla, and Finrier, 3 exceedingly powerful sorcerers. They don't have the ability to constrain them, even though they're miles away from the winds of magic. They have more than enough skills at their hand if they can just speak to get out of the situation they're in. So there is a story here that could be told in a variety of different ways. Eventually, Nagash persuades, gets it out of them somehow, and learns a lot. And 2 things in particular he is about to, magical technologically speaking, figure out. Number 1 is the elixir of youth. And number 2 is that, wait a minute, I don't need a soul to animate a corpse. And that's a huge one. Truly enormous, because this is where we get the first real necromancy. This is where we get the first real step towards figuring out the concepts of necromancy. Now, we've got 2 different versions of when he properly nails this down. We have the more modern version, 8th edition onwards, where when eventually Nagash goes to war, he starts using undead at this point. But as we'll go and look at his time away over in Nagashazar, the earlier versions had him figure it out properly when he was in Nagashazar.
Yeah, and one thing that I think is worth expanding on a little bit is the Mortuary Cult had about 2,000 years to figure things out between Cetra and Nagash, which is really long time. And they had genuinely mastered the art of working with souls through their priestly rites. They the Tomb Kings were not the only difference between like modern Tomb Kings and actual living Nehakara is that they didn't have a bunch of skeletons running around, but they were using the statuary. They had Shopti statues. They had the war sphinxes. They had all these.
Not yet. They get them during the war with Nagash. They drill them down and get them properly when Nagash is winning, and they get all the gods together. All of the kings come together, and that's when they start using the Mortuary Cult in particular. A host of magics they had reluctantly not used, and then the Ashabti come, the Sphinxes come, everything else, and Nagash goes, "Oh, arse." But
yeah,
yes,
I should rephrase
at this point.
I should rephrase that to they had mastered the art of preserving souls.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, they worked with them a lot. And something that we kind of talked about, which does get a little funky, but souls tend to not necessarily hold together super well if there aren't preparations made to protect them. And the Nehakarans have gotten really good at that.
Yeah,
like
and the really weird one is they've got really good at it without really using the winds of magic as we understand them today. Now, they're definitely using like the lore of Nehekara as we understand it in modern times isn't what they're using back then, because they're not so high on using all of the magic yet. They don't truly understand it to the way they will understand it later. So they have managed through almost certainly their connection to the gods as they understand it. They believe the winds of magic are the breath of the gods, if you remember. Through their understanding of it, mastered some soul magic that is quite unlike anything you get anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, and the Liber Necris suggests it's kind of a combination of like the gods revealing information to them, and then they also use rituals to capture what they thought were like desert spirits and stuff, but were more likely like demons or elementals and stuff that also told them things, and they were kind of able to figure stuff out. So they figured what they ended up at is very bizarre, but it's a really interesting series that led them there. But so anyway, Nagash has this. He combines it with dark magic and he creates something unique. Because a lot of the things that the Nehekarans had figured out, because they took such a bizarre path, they had figured out many powerful ideas, many powerful theories, many powerful geometries using magical theory, but they couldn't power it properly. But with dark magic, Nagash instantly solved the power problem. And stuff started to get bad.
Yeah, then Nagash moves, and Nagash takes control. There's quite a lot of story around this, but let's just keep it simple because Nagash is 4,500 years old. We can't spend all the time going over every last detail. He takes over Khemri. And there's one thing to note about this that is worth making clear so that you understand how much more power he's got over a very short period of time. Number one, he is not king. And he has become king. This is as legal as you can get, and all of the people think that the gods themselves will punish everyone for this. It is bad, man, but he's done it anyway because he's that kind of guy. But on top of that, the mortuary cult itself is centered in Khemri, where he rules, and the mortuary cult, which he was a part of, has no power to stop him. And that is something that you've really got to get into your head. He has managed to make a coup to take control because he is so much more above them all already.
Yeah, like Kotep and all them, like the ones that are loyal to the original philosophies of the mortuary cult, they're loyal to the idea of like working for Cetra specifically and all that. They have to flee. Like they have to run away from Khemri and go to the other temples, the other cities, because Nagash is unstoppable to them. It doesn't help that he understands everything they're doing very well. So he's good at messing with it. And he basically starts his own version. He perverts the mortuary cult to his own theory. And he starts taking on acolytes. And this is where we meet the likes of, in the more modern stories, this is where he gets like Archon the Black. This is where he gets Wazoran in a lot of the modern stories. And he even does a very clever thing to manipulate or start kind of manipulating with the other cities, because Nagash knows the other cities are not going to tolerate this. Because the Pantheon's going to be pissed at them. And the mortuary cult can't have this guy going, hey, you know how, we used to give our first sons? Well, yeah, Greno, they can be king now. Like, that's going to cause huge political turmoil if they don't nip that in the bud.
So we've got Nagash as now effectively priest king of Khemri, and this is not a short period of time. We're not talking 5 years he rules, 10 years. It's a good couple of 100 years that he rules, and his age begins to catch up with him because that's what happens. And this is where the elixir of life that he eventually creates comes into place. And much as you'd imagine from the vampires that attempt to copy it later, it starts off with blood. It starts off with an elixir that comes from the blood. Now, different versions will say slightly different versions of how this came to pass. But ultimately, people, as they wander around, are walking, talking repositories of the winds of magic because they gather it through their life, through their very actions. It gets into their blood with the Gyren. Their passions drag down the actuary. And people carry magic in a way that down in Araby and what is the lands of the dead, there isn't that much of it. The winds have petered out to a degree by the time it gets down there. So what gets picked up by the people makes an enormous difference. And he learns a method of distilling the blood to create the elixir of eternal life and, importantly, eternal youth. And that changes, again, everything, because it now means that he can pass that on to some folks and make some pretty loyal pals.
Yeah, and he has all the time in the world. At least from, and a lot of the cities do not like Nagash, but they try fighting him a few times, and they're not really unified yet because the cities are opposed to one another. There's a lot of political strife, there's a lot of conflict, and everyone kind of has it in their head that, oh well, if Kimri's kind of out of the equation, that means one of us could become the new capital. One of us can become the new big important guys. So there isn't a great unified assault against Nagash for a long time. And the few times they do encounter him, his sorcery is just, it's too big. It's too strong.
Yeah. And it's also worth noting he also does one other enormous thing during this period, because he's now mastering his magics. He's not at the point where he's coming to the conclusion, as in he's reached his peak. He's really mastering his magics at this point, and he realizes he just can't get enough of this shit. There is not enough down in the lands of the dead for him to do any great workings. He can figure it all out, and he can actually put 2 and 2 together to get 4 and say this should work, but the spells peter out and do nothing. And this is in many respects the foundation point for the Black Pyramid of Khemri, as he now goes, well, I now need a method of gathering the magics to the center of my power, and the building begins. And his building is not small, as it's put in one of the various sources. I forget which one, but his Black Pyramid in comparison to Cetra's was considered to be the most enormous building you could ever imagine. It was in Khemri, a great white pyramid, which was looked after by the mortuary cult, and they're spilling it with unguents. They're keeping Cetra's soul in there throughout the course of the time, and it is an exceedingly powerful magical artifact in its own right. It's considered to be huge, bigger than the good old pyramid down in Egypt, if you want a comparison. Along comes the Black Pyramid and makes that pyramid look like, well, a tiny little mule in comparison to an elephant. It's truly huge, this one. And it's truly huge and created to specific geometry for a reason. And it's channeling all of the winds into one place so that he can do far bigger, far more capable workings of magic.
Yeah, and it ties really well into the whole thing of Nehekaran magic relies a lot on ritual and very specific construction. The Nehekarans were they didn't have a lot of magic to work with, so everything that they built, like the way they designed statues and their cities and all that stuff, a lot of it, I'm sure they did realize it, but like a lot of the Necrotext designed things because it was meant to channel magic. It was meant to try and guide magic along certain paths. And Nagash takes that and takes everything he learned from all the different sources. And, he's building up his 9 books, which are very, very famous and epic and legendary. And he makes the construction of the Black Pyramid. Thousands and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people die horribly constructing it because Nagash does not care. He does not value life at all in the slightest.
So it's worth saying that during this period, when he's building his Great Pyramid, one big thing is worth being very aware of, and that's that he has to tax like a bastard to bring it about. And this makes him deeply unpopular. Deeply unpopular. Not only are loads of people dying, but all the other kingdoms around him are being called upon to provide extra resource. The black marble that he's using has to be shipped from pretty much the other side of the empire. And these are not a unified people, but he's still demanding things, and that brings a great deal of disenchantment from all the other kings across the Nehekaran Empire, and eventually turns to outright war.
Yeah, the kind of the funny thing is it's not the sacrilege that really ends up undoing Nagash in this first big war. It's that he puts too much pressure on all the other cities. He kind of gets impatient, and even though he kind of figures out, I would say that until he finishes the Black Pyramid, he doesn't really demonstrate the ability to have like unstoppable legions of like undead, because he's not able to rely on them as easily for like constructing the Black Pyramid, because there's just not enough for him to work with. But he is strong enough to threaten all the cities and say, if you don't comply, I'm going to come over there and mess you up, and I'll take all your citizens and make them into slaves. So you better keep sending me stuff. And this is what unifies all the cities against him.
Yeah, the 7 kingdoms, as it's often referred to.
Yeah. So everybody gets together and a huge war breaks out. Huge war.
Yeah, war. Huh. Whoa. And what's it good for? It's good for binding together the mortuary cult against Nagash. And it's the first time that they actively say Nagash is actually wrong and is bad, and we're going to war with him. This is quite different to what they were doing before, where they were sort of going, yeah, he's not great, but, we'll work around it. Yeah, what he's doing is a bit dodge.
The gods will take care of it.
Yeah, it'll be fine. The gods, they're now saying he's going against the gods. The gods have a very specific set of ways we're supposed to be doing things. He ain't doing it that way. And not only that is he not doing it that way, he's going against it in multiple places. And this whole elixir that he's using, the people that are using it are just wrong. Your Arkan the Blacks, for example. And he's just a bit wrong. And no, screw it. We're going against them. And that's when we get our first real Ushabti coming around, as the gods themselves start taking to war alongside what will become the proper Tomb King army in the end. So along they come. We've got our big sphinxes popping along, and they're effectively going against what is the first real undead army. On the other side, we have Arkan the Black doing his thing. We've got skeletons coming up for the first time. Actual skeletons without souls. This is not the souls of their previous occupants coming back and working through their old
these are
body.
just puppets.
This is just puppets. This is completely different to any type of necromancy that has been seen before. In fact, it's the birth of true necromancy. And this war is desperate. Particularly desperate for Nagash, because he's going to lose.
Yeah, and something, it's like Nagash is super strong at this point. Like the Black Pyramid, he finishes it, and it does give him an obscene amount of, granted, it doesn't have necessarily as much time as it will have later to charge up, because although it can store the winds of magic, that's the thing, it's a big battery. It draws magic to it, and it stores it, but that doesn't mean it started off full. And Nagash is still in many ways human. He's human adjacent at this point.
I would argue he's almost, other than the fact that he's taken an elixir which effectively allows him to maintain his eternal youth, he still looks from the outside 100% human. If you look at him, you'll look at him and you will see someone who's clearly a Nehekaran. He's got the general features of a Nehekaran. He's not a gigantic undead skeletal chap.
No, he
just looks like a dude.
Yeah, most people would feel relatively confident that if you stabbed him in the heart, he would die. Yeah, at this point. So, big fight in more modern versions of the story. This is when Nagash has his 9 Mortarks, but they're all kind of these immortal guys that are running around fighting. They're all very scary in their own ways. Most of them know how to use magic, at least to a decent degree. Arkan the Black is the most powerful next to Nagash himself. He's Nagash's most favorite servant because Arkan is exceedingly loyal. The novels paint him in a very different light, which I'm not a huge fan of, but I
do not like that either.
In the modern stories and a lot of the old stories, Arkan is disturbingly loyal. And it's usually because he was in a really not great place, and Nagash raised him up because he was so efficient. And Nagash didn't care if your nobility. Nagash didn't care about royalty. He didn't care if you were favored by the gods. Will you do what he tells you to, and you'll do it well? Welcome to the team. Welcome to the party.
And there's a couple of things to add here, because this small scene, which is arguably utterly essential to Nagash and where he goes, takes a couple of different forms. So it's worth very quickly detailing the different ones. Importantly, it is, how does this elixir of eternal life work? Now, according to almost all now of the sources, and you could argue the 8th edition army list doesn't quite suggest this anymore, but it doesn't deny it. It makes you quite averse to sunlight. You don't like it. Now, it doesn't mean you burst into flat fire, vampire-wise, but it most certainly means that you are averse to it. If you go back to, however, the 4th edition army list, so this is where Nagash was first put in, when he loses, Khemri is taken, the Black Pyramid is raided, they go through all the traps, and they take out all of his closest servants who've been necking the elixir of eternal life. They pull them out, they burst into flame and die, which is not so good. In later versions, instead, what happens is Arkan, and all the rest are yanked out of the pyramid, and they are killed. One way or another. Whether they burst into flames, whether they die through another matter, doesn't really matter in the greater scheme of things. They all die, but they don't find Nagash.
Yeah, and I think it's worth exploring that there's a lot of interesting things that you could look into as far as why sunlight does that, as far as sunlight in the Warhammer world, just like in our world's mythology, is seen as a very purifying force. I would argue it probably has a lot of hish associated with it, which might be fairly antithetical to them because they're not fully normal creatures. They have a lot of magical evidence essence sustaining them at that point, and Hish does not like that stuff. It breaks it down. And also Thra is by this point, I would argue he's almost the second most powerful member of the Pantheon as opposed to the most powerful, because Usirian is just nuts by this point because he's got all those souls in his underworld with him.
And Jaff as well.
Yeah.
Totally.
But Thra is still a big boy. And he's that father of that Pantheon, and he does not like what's going on. And I think that there's a lot to be said that the combination of factors, I would absolutely believe that Nagash and his buddies, Sunlight's probably not their favorite thing. But as we said, 7 armies come to fight Nagash. They keep beating him back. It's a horrible war. A lot of people die, but ultimately the Nehakarns triumph because their mastery of their forms of magic and the fact that the gods are really heavily involved to the point where the Nehakarns are literally able to bring back the Nehakaran dead and put them inside statuary that can match Nagash's undead and are way stronger. You know, they're not made of feeble bones and rotten flesh. No, they're stone and marble that's moving and just crushing bodies and cutting through, and Nagash just can't stop it. It's too much. Nagash just can't find a way to stop it.
Yeah, and when you're looking at the Upshadti that come as well, they are quite literally effigies of the gods themselves coming in to crush and squash folk.
You know, something that actually caught me off guard. This is a total aside, but I just want to say because
I found it interesting.
I'm pretty sure in the old lore, the Ushabti are they're controlled by the gods themselves, if I remember right.
Yeah, when they're very first introduced, they're very much empowered by the Lich Priests in that they're the ones that bring it about. But then the gods pretty much take over and go stomp, 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 stomp. And they're the ones that are largely responsible for doing
I thought that was still the case in this book, but it's not.
It's not really.
Yeah, in this book, they're like all the other Nehakarn statuary, where it's literally just a dead Nehakarn soldier is put into them, and it's like, go have fun, new body.
Yeah, it's a touch more Necron in terms of how it presents.
Anyway, that doesn't matter. So, Nagash loses, and Nagash is there's a siege at the Black Pyramid. Nagash and all of his guys retreat to the Black Pyramid because that's where they're at their strongest, and they still lose. And Nagash... Nagash, I think the best version of the story, because it demonstrates a lot about Archon, is that Nagash thinks he's going to win, and he's standing outside, and when he realizes he's going to lose, he starts running away into the Black Pyramid. And all of the kings and their greatest soldiers try to go after him, but Archon blocks the way. Yes, and Archon is literally a one-man army. Like, he's fighting everybody off, and according to the 8th edition story, my favorite version of the story, it's actually an unknown soldier that kills him. Someone throws a javelin, and just through pure dumb luck, it hits Archon in the heart. And as Archon is dying, he utters a curse that says, "Any man that tries to move my body will suffer a death that will destroy your soul," which to the Nehakarns is literally the scariest concept in existence. Dying for them is kind of whatever, but your soul being obliterated. And Archon collapses to the ground, and very dramatically, his body bursts into flames, and all that's left is a charred black skeleton, Archon the Black. And he's literally just a skeleton sitting there with a javelin through his chest, and nobody touches him, and they can't get around him. So they just go, you know what? Screw it, we're going to go in a different way. So they move around and they find other entrances. But by that point, like Andy said, they find all of the other Mortarks and all the other generals and stuff, drag them out. They're all butchered or burned up in sunlight, whatever. And they finally get to Nagash's sarcophagus. They rip it open, and he's not there.
There's nobody there. And it's also worth adding one small detail. And several versions of the background for this story here, the Mortarks, or whatever particular name you're going for them at this point, they're all pretty much sleeping in sarcophaguses themselves by this point. They are effectively archetypical vampires, but not actually vampires. They're prototypical, might be a better way of putting it.
Proto-vampires,
yeah, they're proto-vampires, but in many respects, much better because they don't carry any of the curses or any of the downsides. But in one respect, much worse, because Nagash actually needs to give them the potion. And almost all versions of the background say this, although it's skimmed over in 8, whether once you've taken it, you've got it forever, or whether you have to keep on necking it. But most of them suggest that Nagash controls them and maintains loyalty by parceling it out, because he keeps that secret in one of his books of Nagash and ensures that nobody else gets that secret.
Yeah, what I honestly think is, I could have swear I've seen this written somewhere, is that I believe he gives himself an Archon a pure version where it's a one and done, you're good, and he gives the others a not as good version. Like he dilutes it for me. Because so he can control them, because he knows they're like black-hearted fiends and thieves and just the worst.
And you will find repeatedly over the course of time, as Nagash progresses as a character, he constantly doubts others and manipulates and controls. So you often find when someone randomly arrives, it's because he's been manipulating them from afar to arrive, often because they themselves use necromancy, and he is largely the one, for a better word, as it will become, the god of necromancy, but he uses necromancy to control others. So yeah, nice.
Yeah, so Nagash is gone, and the Priest Kings go, well, he's gone. And they start, and they kind of start falling among themselves as far as politics. They start arguing, and it's the king of Lamia, which I want to say is Lamashizaj at this point.
I think it is, but there's
which is Neferata's dad. For anyone that's keeping track, he had the most dramatic impact on the war, and everybody really liked him. So he takes over Khemri. He becomes the priest king of Khemri, so he leaves home, and he tells his son Lamashizar to go home, and says, "You go back. You're in charge with your sister now. Go do stuff." So at this point, Nagash vanishes, and we find him later in that he had nowhere to go because he didn't think he could lose because he's arrogant as hell. So Nagash is wandering the wastes. He goes northeast.
Eventually, yes. Although it's worth stating, this is not a short wander. It's almost 3 and a bit centuries of wandering, and it's left very, very opaque as to what occurs during this. There is one source that says he dies during this period, but doesn't strictly speaking die because of his mastery of necromancy, and instead passes over into what will have a variety of different names depending upon which theology you follow, but the lands of the dead, and gains a depth and an awareness and an understanding of the place that is quite beyond anything that any other human mortal had achieved. But eventually he does indeed go northeast, and he finds himself at the banks of the Sour Sea.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that his death, I've seen 2 or 3 different versions that say he does die on this journey. And one of the really interesting ones says that he doesn't even realize he dies. Like he basically, he's so exhausted and beaten down. Like he was wounded in the fighting. He's not in good shape. And as far as he knows, he's just been stumbling onwards, but eventually his body gives out. And
it's only 50 years he's away. It's 300 when he's at the other bit. Sorry, pardon me. Just
okay. Still, 50 years is a really fucking long time.
It's still a long time, but it's 50 years.
Yeah, and he doesn't have any food or water. He's in the desert, and he dies. And a lot of versions say that eventually by wandering, he finds his way back to his mortal form. And he basically, because of his knowledge of necromancy and all this stuff, crawls back into his own body and just wills himself to move.
Because Nagash.
Yeah, and it's something worth saying, that Nagash has actually a lot of parallels with Settra. They are very, very similar in a lot of ways. Both of them, their obsession with avoiding or controlling better death. They both, one thing that's actually interesting is Settra, like Nagash, wanted to learn magic, and he actually does through brute force. But Settra didn't have dark elf teachers. He only had the secrets of the mortuary cult. So he learned enough that the cult couldn't manipulate him, because he knew how to kind of work their stuff. But Settra's a very, very, very weak wizard. He's a very weak wizard because he has such a basic understanding of it. And that pissed him off a lot. But he learned that just through pure brute force, which is insane. If you know, the fact that Settra forced himself to learn magic is bonkers. But anyway, so they have a lot of these parallels, but Nagash makes his way back to his body in a lot of versions of the story. My favorite version of the story, And he gets up, and like Andy says, he makes his way to the Sour Sea, where he finds something very interesting.
Oh, the Sour Sea. Now, there's a reason it's called the Sour Sea. It's called the Sour Sea because there is water that's coming from a mountain very close by, a mountain that will one day be called Cripple Peak, and there's a reason it's called Cripple Peak. And this water is filled with warpstone. It's filled with magic. And he gets there and he senses it. He starts drinking it. He becomes almost obsessed by it because of what it immediately provides him. Now, he's been wandering around. The winds of magic itself are growing stronger as he goes north. But this is completely unlike that. And he, as a master already of dark magic, someone who can sense the power that's lying within here, follows that power to its source. A long time ago, a chunk of warpstone had struck into the side of Cripple Peak, and it had struck right down into the depths of it. And this piece of warpstone, according to most sources, is the biggest single chunk of warpstone that exists in the Warhammer world. It won't be forever. Indeed, it can get depleted in time, but at this point, it is actually enormous. A huge chunk of pure magic. Welcome to Nagash, moving from being Nagash, the not exactly mortal, but certainly human, to Nagash, the, oh my goodness, my flesh is melting away because I am using this stuff and consuming it, and importantly, controlling it.
Yeah, one of the things that's like Andy said, this mountain was a big mountain, and this warpstone meteor obliterates it. Like it just destroys this mountain and eats its kind of like a mini Great Maw. Is a really good way to think of it.
The Sour Sea, that big computer, that's largely the crater that struck into it. So the Sour Sea has formed into the crater where it went, and the mountain itself has the warpstone chunk embedded at the bottom, and it needs to be mined to even be accessed.
Yeah, and what's interesting is it gets buried because it caused so much destruction, but there wasn't anything around it. So it's not like the Great Maw, which was probably bigger, but like hit a civilization and immediately transformed, and a bunch of crazy shit happened. This was out by itself. There was virtually nothing out there, and like it was, and it is left undisturbed for a very long time. So Nagash, like he says, drinks from the Sour Sea, and Nagash, one of the things that's very unique about him that is really interesting is Nagash has a very particular form of arrogance compared to a lot of characters in the Warhammer world, where a lot of the characters we get that tend to be like the arrogant villains care a lot about their appearance or about maintaining like a certain visage. Nagash is deliberately pointed out as being unique in that he does not give a damn what he looks like. He doesn't care how monstrous he becomes. He doesn't care if he looks human. All he cares about is power.
Yeah, and I would say that this is the point when that absolutely becomes the case. Previous to this, he was a priest king. That's what he thought of himself as, a priest king. A priest king with high levels of arrogance and high levels of, I want to control everything, but nevertheless a priest king. He's been ousted, he's broken, he's been wandering the wastes for 50 years, he's possibly died and wandered further than just simply the wastes. He's found himself this great source of magic. And what does he do first? He becomes a priest king again. And this is something that's often sort of sidelined, but over the course of the next 200 years, he builds another empire, a massive empire around Nagash. He uses his necromancy to not just create undead and automatons to help him do all of his great works. He uses it to help build an enormous fortress, arguably, according to some sources, the biggest bastion in the Warhammer world. They often forget about it because the Games Workshop never really uses it. It's always something that's down there that exists.
To be fair, really nothing near it.
Yeah, there's nothing else there. And he gets tribes in, they worship him as a god, and we're not talking about a small number of people here. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who are mining for him, who are getting warpstone dust, who are getting warpstone, who are building a huge fortress and a network of fortifications around it. Nagash, the entire place that he eventually builds, is an enormous fortress with an enormous number of troops, and they're not just undead as many people like to think of with Nagash. Indeed, the undead are outnumbered by the living because all of the local tribes pretty much become his mates. because, well, he's a god to them. He also changes big time. He moves from being just simply the priest king to slowly sloughing flesh. To begin with, it's just muscle over bone, and slowly that muscle begins to go as well. His repeated use of warpstone in a fashion that is far heavier and far more drastic than even the Skaven attempt completely minces him. His eyes bubble out and turn pus-filled pits of yellowy green horror. He massively, for want of a better word, mutates. He increases in size and he gets bigger. His bones lengthen, his body changes, and it reaches the point where he can't control it anymore, and it goes beyond his ability to properly harness using his dark magics. So he builds himself a set of armor to encase himself inside, to completely bound it up. And to help bind the great magics, he uses lead as not a complete diminisher. He doesn't use obsidian, but to help control it. And Gromril. This is something that you don't often hear. It's made of star metal. Gromril. His armor is Gromril and lead. Holy shit.
Morricaine, the black armor. Yeah,
fucking right. And he builds this himself to constrain himself. And this is when he's effectively almost the Nagash we all know and love. He is a much bigger individual by this time. By the time his armor is created, that pretty much grounds him into place. And it's also at about this time he starts having massive problems, because he's not the only one that's interested in the warpstone.
Yeah, and I think it's worth stepping back into that kind of 300-year period of Nagash does some really interesting things at this point when he drinks with the sour, so he figures out, it's coming from this mountain. He goes in the mountain, finds the warpstone, he starts feeding on it, Nagash literally eats raw warpstone, which is nuts. Like, nobody does that. But he does, because he just doesn't care. And he's very power hungry and power mad, and he's never seen anything like this. Like, even the dark magic, even the magic in the Black Pyramid, nothing like this.
Yep.
Like Andy said, he builds Nagash's are on top of this warpstone thing, and it's literally, as the warpstone's being mined out, another layer's added, another layer. Like, it's like a dwarf hold, except for bigger in a lot of cases.
Fucking huge. And you cannot underestimate how much warpstone was there.
Yeah, and also, like Andy said, there were a lot of human tribes. As something that we know about, like the Empire and stuff, is a lot of humans actually migrated from the Darklands. Yeah. And like kind of that area, and like in our world, humans tend to be in areas where there is ocean or rivers or things like that. And the Brittle Peaks had a lot of these waterways. Now, obviously, they had some corruption in them, which probably caused some interesting issues. But there were a lot of people living around these oceans along the southern coast, far away from what would eventually become Chaos Dwarf lands.
Yep.
And these people are kind of Nagash notices them, and he kind of starts going down to them, and they worship him as a god because he is immensely powerful. And Nagash does some really fucked up stuff to these people, and he introduces to them a ritual of cannibalism.
The feasting.
Yes, and he creates the first ghouls. Like, ghouls were
by
not,
mistake.
Yes, ghouls were actually not a naturally occurring process. Except for, like, because in later lore we get it kind of more established that there are ways that cannibal creatures can show up, but they're very rare, and it's very specific circumstances. Nagash factory produces that shit.
Yeah, it does. And it's not an intended part. All the warpstone dust that's created by the mining, all of the corruption that is inherent in that warpstone being there seeps out into his people, and his worship in turn is pretty damn dark. Just drawn more dark magic in. Yeah, it's absolutely. Just drawn it in. And that extraordinary concentration of dark magic in what is his empire makes significant changes on the people that are there. It does form the first ghouls. It arguably forms a lot of other issues as well. There's one other fun fact that's worth dropping in here too, because his empire actually extends far into the Darklands. It extends in both directions, and one of the areas that he takes over there is effectively a giant dragon graveyard.
Yeah,
And
the dragon graveyard. Yeah.
White. And the very first zombie dragons are made by Nagash during this period, and he rides one of those fuckers around because he's Nagash, goddammit.
That's fucking awesome.
And how awesome is that? One enormous zombie dragon with Nagash sitting on the back of it.
That needs to be a legacy
that
model.
Oh, that would
such
be amazing.
Yeah. So so anyway, he makes a lot of big discoveries, adds even more to his 9 books, like we were talking about what was going on with because fun fact, cannibalism will actually draw dark magic to you. Like the process of eating human flesh will literally draw dark magic in, which is why you shouldn't do it. That's why in the Warhammer world, it is heavily the Warhammer world has a really interesting perspective on cannibalism, of that the writers actively have this thing of people do it out of desperation, but even if you do it for morally justifiable reasons, you cannot escape the dar, and it will affect you unless you're just like an immensely willful individual. That's how Morngulls are created, for instance, is often people that are caught in the mountains in the horrible cold, and they eat people to try and survive, and it brings dark magic to them, and they degenerate into something way worse than a ghoul, but that's a very specific type of that transformation, whereas ghouls are the more common.
Yeah, totes. And there's an actual reason for that if you want to go down into the lore a little bit. I'll very briefly lighten it. Animals don't have all the winds of magic inside them because Heish, which is the source of intellect, the source of actual imagination, is not really in animals. They do not have a higher in intellect, where the higher various species do. Quite a chunk of Heish just sitting in their heads. And that mixture of all the magics is what effectively, when you combine it together, creates Dar. And upon death, all of the various bits begin to corrode and all mix together. So whatever magic was held inside that body effectively becomes a small source of Dar. You start dropping yourself down into cannibalism, you are taking your first steps towards consuming Dar. There are ways around it, but for the vast majority of people, they do not know those ways.
Yeah. So around this point, Nagash is building up, and like he's still thinking about revenge big time. But Nagash is patient. He's very patient. He's got all the time in the world, and he's just building up, and he starts forging a lot of artifacts. Like Andy said, he forges his armor. I believe he forges the crown of sorcery in this time.
He does. If I'm getting this right, let me see. So the Skaven attack first, and then he forges his armor afterwards because he realizes he needs it. So as I recall, the Skaven attack first. They want the warp stone because it's the biggest chunk.
That much warp stone, and Nagash is mining it. It's being used.
So
word gets out.
Skaven come up from underneath, and they basically go to war with Nagash, and that lasts for 100 years. It's not a short war. The Council of 13 want this shit. This is their shit as far as they're concerned. And eventually Nagash comes to deal with them. He basically says, just fucking stop.
Yeah, it's a stalemate.
And I will give you some warpstone in return. In fact, why don't we work together? You do stuff for me, and I will give you warpstone. You do stuff for me, and I will give you warpstone. And that is what ends that part of the war. But nonetheless, the Council of 13 are enormously suspicious. They're Skaven. Of course they are. They can't help themselves. And then the Great Seam of Gromwell is exposed by an impact, and that is when he makes his armor.
Yeah, and once again, another point in how powerful Nagash has come at this point, in that he's able to wield necromancy powerful enough that the Skaven, well, it kind of shows how scary both the Skaven and Nagash are, that the Skaven are used to just overwhelming. They've crippled the Dwarf Empire by this point. They've had a pretty solid stream of victories in a lot of ways, and they go fight Nagash, and they realize they cannot beat him because even if they have a great attack and they kill a lot of guys, he just they fight using mass numbers. And that is the worst strategy to use against a necromancer.
Amen to that.
Because he just turns it against you. But Nagash realizes that he can't deal with them either. He doesn't really understand what the Skaven are. He doesn't understand where they're coming from. and
they just don't freaking stop.
Yeah, and of course the Skaven aren't risking anybody actually important. It's just mass hordes, and occasionally they'll throw something weird at him, like a monster or machine or whatever. And Nagash he wants to focus on his own shit. He doesn't want to deal with this. And so, like Andy says, he makes a deal. And the deal is actually super interesting that the Skaven, they bring him a lot of they basically are kind of like super nasty messengers and assassins for him. They bring him information. He starts learning about what's going on in Hekara. The Skaven start feeding him different little things he wants to know. They bring him various little pieces of info and relics and artifacts.
They also bring him orcs.
Yeah, they bring him a ton of orcs.
And they don't so much bring them as in, here's my bag of orcs. What they do is they drive orc tribes down towards them, which are used for a mixture of sacrifices and later are used as they channel them towards the lands of the dead in the south and start the first steps towards what will become Nagash's war with them.
Yeah, Nagash, that's the big part of his deal, is that he asks them, I need you to direct as many orc tribes here as possible. And the Skaven are like, yeah, we can, and I will give you a literal cartload of warpstone in exchange. And the Skaven, and like Andy said, the Skaven do think it's weird. They don't understand why he wants that. But they kind of do this funny thing where because they're Skaven, they're like, all right, whatever, we don't give a shit. But they do keep spying on him.
Yeah, they're short-term goal species.
Yeah, and hey, Clan Eshin, they're good at their job. Like even Nagash with all of his senses and stuff, Clan Eshin does actually manage to do a good job keeping tabs on him. But Nagash is very secretive and he doesn't explain his plans to anyone. He hasn't resurrected Archon at this point. Like he's literally just doing his own little thing. So nobody can really figure out what he's up to.
It's also worth saying that we've got a 100-year war here. So everything that the Skaven can do to beat him, he's already defeated. So be aware that means all manner of assassins, all manner of different types of attack have failed. And during this period, the Council of 13 moved from being, we can take him, to actually being terrified of him because everything they've tried has failed completely. They just can't do anything. And not only has it failed, he hasn't grown any weaker at all. If anything, he's grown more powerful. And the more they throw at him, the more he seems to grow. And that's terrifying to them because that's their way of fighting, as Sotek says.
Yeah, and we're talking about literally the kitchen sink. Like Screaming Bells, Graciers, Clan Mulder, Clan Eshin, like pretty much every clan except Pestilence because they're not here yet. But like everybody else, everything. And it bounces.
Quite. I think we go to a meanwhile at this point.
Yeah, so
there's some stuff happening down in with the old lobby.
Yeah, so I'm going to once again, I'm ignoring a lot of Black Library novels on this particular topic because this has been touched by actually a couple different authors, and I don't like their versions. I prefer the
army list.
The army books and the roleplay books.
Yeah.
But Neferata, awesome character who has a lot of ambitions and wants a lot of power, but she's limited due to her station as the Queen of Lamia because her brother's the king. She's technically the queen. And her brother, he's an idiot. And she ends up getting him killed to get him out of the way. But one of the things that she does is, if I recall correctly, she wants to learn sorcery, but she's not allowed to.
Yeah, there's quite a few conflicting bits. What you can say is,
I'll let you go ahead.
When Khemri falls, she gets her hands on at least one, if not multiple, books of Nagash from the pyramid. She's the one that gets them. Now, there's different stories as to how she gets them. And let's just stick with the obvious one. She gets them herself through her agents, because that's an easy one. Some of the other ones are well dodged, and I don't like them.
Yeah, that's my preferred version as well, is that she actively sent... the Neferata, I think it's worth saying that Neferata knew, because everybody knew, that Nagash had figured out a better version of immortality. He had figured out eternal youth. And Neferata says, I want that shit. I need it.
I mean, who wouldn't?
Yeah. Like, I want to live forever, and B, I don't want the crappy version that the mortuary cult has. I want the real deal. So she wants that more than anything in the universe. And she gets it, in a sense.
Yeah, she gets it. And there's multiple readings of this, because you've got the classic Games Workshop description of it, where vampires are bad guys. You just, it's that simple. They're bad guys, which means that the curse that comes along with this failed version of replicating the potion is horrendous and it's awful and they have to drink blood now. But there's also another reading of this. When you look at what the original elixir of eternal youth, for want of a better description, could do, and what she creates out of it, she creates a version that doesn't require any re-imbibement. It doesn't require you take it again. So if you believe that the previous version required taking it every once in a while, she's found a different one. You just need to take blood instead. Take in pure magic that's been distilled through a material body. And that allows you to live for freaking ever. This is before we have all the curses that are laid upon vampires. So there's no real problem with sunlight at this point. There's no real problem with various gods smiting you down. All you have is an eternal thirst for blood, which in the greater scheme of things is not entirely different to saying we as mortals have an eternal thirst for water. We must eat food. We're starving all the freaking time. It's not that different, except, blood. Taking that.
It's worth saying that Neferata, in most versions of the story, she invents this. It's not like she is a genius when it comes to dealing with elixirs and potions and a lot of these things, which probably has a lot to do with either a station she had or her involvement with. Usually she has a lot of involvements with the different cults, but doesn't have the power that she wants. And granted, she is often said not to be very good at sorcery and kind of struggles with it, especially at this point in her life. But she has very helpful agents that she relies on. Like she has Wazoran, who is a very, very granted. Turns out that Wazoran is originally one of Nagash's acolytes. That Nagash, I will say, one of the brilliant moves that Nagash did is that Nagash faked a coup where he staged a whole incident where he acted like his mortuary cult betrayed him and they were trying to assassinate him, and he chases them all out. He's like, get out of Kimry. How dare you betray me? And so they flee to the other cities and are like, oh, we tried to fight Nagash and he kicked us out. Can we come in? And they're like, oh, yeah. And then they start influencing the cities. And Wazoran is one of these individuals. He's very loyal to Nagash. He worshipped Nagash.
Yeah, you can't go wrong with Nagash. The dude's a genius. And it's really easily forgotten. He wages war with the entire Skaven species and does not lose. In fact, not only does he not lose, he doesn't lose any ground and expands. The dude's pretty damn good at what he does. So let's cut this whole part because it's not really Nagash relevant particularly. She creates vampires, effectively. And the rest of the kingdoms down there do not like this. They look at that and they're like, yeah, no, that's wrong. That's against the gods. We've already established just how important the mortuary cult is to not only the locals, but all of what is now the lands of the dead. And they go, yeah, no, and they go to war with her.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that it's very obvious to anyone that sees the vampires that it's Nagash magic, it's Nagash stuff. And they're like, hey, we got rid of that, y'all. And we all agreed we weren't going to use Nagash's crap. And you look what y'all are doing. And the other thing is, there were some individuals that were very invested in toppling Lamia for various reasons.
Oh, yeah.
And the vampires of Lamia did not have good PR. They were very decadent and they were assholes. And Abarash, to his credit, tried to rein them in. They didn't care. They told them to piss off because they were having fun. They were the worst kind of immortals, where they were indulging in just awful garbage and they didn't care. So, repeat of the siege of Kimry and the Black Pyramid, and the vampires thought they were awesome, but you can't defeat all of the Hekara. It's just not going to happen, especially when it's led by
I don't think it's quite Alcadazar yet.
I think it's a generation before him.
Because he binds them all together afterwards, because the individual kingdoms are quite fractious at this point, and the Lamians are enough to half bring them together, and they almost go to war with each other. Then Alcadazar, bang, brings them all back underneath one rule again.
Yeah, he is alive at this point.
Yeah,
I believe he
as I recall,
in the fight.
Yeah. The vampires get kicked out. And they spread out and they make their way over to where Nagash is. Now, there are different versions of this story. There's only two that are worth mentioning. One is it was Nagash's plan all along, and this gave him all the generals that he needed for his army. Vampires, yay! Or alternatively, them arriving lets Nagash go, holy shit, look at what they've become. Because effectively, if you want to look at them, they've got the undead trait. he pretty much can do whatever the fuck he wants with them because he's the master of undead. He sees them and goes, oh, hell yes. This is so much better than what I had before. In fact, they've managed to create themselves something that's actually better than what I've built for my generals. I love it. Great. Regardless of your version, he uses the vampires to become the generals of his empire.
Yeah, there's some really funny versions of the story where Wazoran like reestablishes contact with Nagash because he realizes Nagash isn't dead. And that actually is what leads the rest of the kingdoms to discovering that Lamia is corrupt, is they catch some of those missives because Wazoran was sending love letters to Nagash. but in any event, that is one of the best parts. Is this demonstrates Nagash's mastery over necromancy, and that when the vampires flee, they don't even know where they're going, and they just kind of are drawn to Nagash without even realizing it. They just like hear a voice on the wind or a compulsion telling them to come to this place. And like Andy said, they show up, and in most versions of the story, Nagash looks down and goes, "Oh, these are cool." Like, what? Look at you. And they present themselves to Nagash, and the vampires, they want revenge against the rest of Nehekhara for the destruction of Lamia, especially Neferata. And this is where a really interesting thing happens in the story, where one of the last vampire, one of the original 7, and debatably the most powerful, depending on how you look at it, is Vashanesh. And Vashanesh, which for anyone that doesn't know, Vashanesh later becomes Vlad von Karstein. Or is really? Vlad von Karstein. Yeah, shocker. But like he shows up, and Vashanesh is actually a descendant in some versions of the story. He's actually directly descended from Nagash. And Nagash, like we said, very fucking arrogant. And Vashanesh has a presence about him. There's something very regal, and he stands out in an interesting way, which is why Neferata married him. Fun fact. He was her first husband.
Yep.
But Nagash Nagash goofs without realizing it at this point, because I think between the thing of Vashanesh being his descendant and also Nagash maybe not being the best when it comes to viewing genders or however you want to call it, Nagash goes, "Oh, you invented vampires, you're the first vampire, that's cool. Your husband will be my general, not you." And man,
so fucking sexist.
Man, would he come to regret that later.
Yeah,
but
that was a big mistake. I mean, you've also got the nice little vampire repeated part here where you could argue that Vashanesh looks almost identical to Nagash. Yeah. And you can argue that Isabella von Karstein looks almost identical to Neferata if you catch them. That repeated, "Oh, it's my lover from the past." I love vampire gothic tales, love that shit. But anyway, that's slightly beside the point. Now, in some of the stories, the priest kings some rebel priest kings become aware of Nagash because of all this, and they start sending emissaries up to Nagash as well and saying, "Hey, can we join your side?" The various other priest kings, they do not like this. Nagash becomes part of the bigger picture now, and war is coming. Particularly with good old Alcatrazar down there being rather unchuffed with the fact that Nagash is definitely not dead.
Yeah, he takes it kind of personally, and Alcatrazar becomes Alcatrazar the Conqueror because he pulls a Cetra, and a lot of people call him Cetra Reborn because he's that scary. In battle, he's a genius tactician, he's an amazing fighter, and he just starts kicking everybody's asses and unifying the cities because he realizes Nagash is coming, and he knows how bad it's going to be. Well, he probably doesn't, but he thinks he knows how bad it's going to be. So he unifies all the cities, and Nagash at this point pulls another borderline genius move, though it doesn't work as well as he would hope, which is Nagash wants to signify to the vampires that Vashanesh is in charge, and so he's like, "Hey, Vashanesh, I'm going to make you a gift." And he gives Vashanesh a ring.
A very power.
Yeah. A very special ring that a lot of you are probably familiar with when it comes to Vlad von Karstein.
Oh, yeah.
And he tells them, as long as you have this ring, you cannot die. You will be truly unkillable, which is like, hell, what a gift. But what Nagash doesn't tell him until he puts it on is it also binds him to Nagash's will. And because Nagash never gives anything freely. He does not do that. If Nagash gives you a gift, run away.
100%.
Yeah, so and Vashanesh realizes this pretty much the instant he puts on the ring of
Yep.
that all the vampires are now directly under Nagash's control because Nagash doesn't really give a shit about them.
Because the ring also lets him control the other vampires. Don't
Yeah.
forget that
Oh,
part.
yeah. Their shared connection
It's
because
a
they all
whole pyramid scheme.
yeah, they all share a connection through that
Mhm.
elixir that they all drank from, and then their descendants because they all gave them the blood kiss. So Nagash in one fell swoop just gets all of them.
Yep. Dick move, and a good way of turning them all against you, whether that was the intention or not.
Yeah,
And
he could have been diplomatic about it, but Nagash doesn't do diplomacy.
No, he doesn't. So it's time for a bit of the old war. Huh!
Yeah,
whoa,
the second Great War against Nagash. Nagash comes down from the north, and the first thing he does is he like kind of borderline smites Khemri. Of that, he's always been able to establish connection with the Black Pyramid, but now he comes back in force, and it's had hundreds of years to charge up.
Mm-hmm.
And so this thing is full of dark magic, and the first thing he does is he resurrects Archon the Black. Like, because Nagash, I would almost be hilariously, if this spawns fan art, I'd be so happy. I would almost suggest there's almost a little something extra going on between those two, because Nagash instantly is like, I gotta get my boyfriend. I gotta go pick him up.
Go get me boy back.
Yeah.
Come on, Archon.
And Archon's just been sitting there. Literally nobody's touched him. The curse has passed down for generations. And Archon gets up and goes, Master, what do you need me to do? And he's like, come back. You're my Mortark. Return to me. And Archon gets... And one thing is, this is actually another big snub to the vampires, is Archon returns this Lich who they don't even know who he is. Like, they've heard about him, but like none of them ever met him. And Nagash goes, he's in charge. He's your boss. Which does not go over well. Like, Wazoran is literally the only one of the vampires that likes Nagash. And it's because he's literally a teacher's pet. It always has been.
Sadly, though, poor old Nagash is a problem. Alcadazar is a freaking genius at war. No other way of putting it. An actual genius. Nagash, in his confidence, in his hubris, I would argue, is so confident that he's going to win that he pretty much just throws everything down there and assumes that it's going to come to pass. And it absolutely does not.
Yeah, he doesn't even participate in the war, really. Like, and that's once again his level of arrogance, because Nagash is now, we're past the point of Nagash wanting to be the great king of Nehekara, and we are full in Nagash thinks I am God. Like,
yeah, he's been worshipped now as a god for several hundred years by his own little empire up in Nagashazar. And it's not a small empire. This is a large amount of space that he controls.
Yeah, it takes up pretty much the southern World's Edge Mountains, all around the Sour Sea and into the Dark Land. Big empire.
And when he goes to war with them, they send down ships down the Sour Sea, down into the ocean down there. They come in from the Lamian side. The troops are coming down from that side. It is a proper huge war. And they are going to town with each other. And Nagash is not just certain he's going to win. It's already largely a done deal, except it isn't.
Yeah, so he sits on his throne back home. Archon's in charge of the war. And one thing that's really important is that Arcan's a decent general, but he's not nearly as gifted as Alcadazar is. Anywhere Alcadazar is leading the Khemrian or the Nehekaran forces, he is winning. Like they still have all their awesome things. They still have all their shop tea. There are still all these giant statuary running around. There are a lot of like powerful entities that are active and fighting back. You have got your Khemric Titans, all sorts of cool shit throwing down. The Nagash tries to go through the Valley of Kings. The Valley of King has statuary that literally start smashing through his armies. Things get crazy. And the point I was going to is that Archon makes a bit of a critical mistake, and it's because of him and Nagash, in that they don't actually care about the vampires, and they are using them as beat sticks to try and solve the problem. They can't beat Alcadazar through genius, so they try and beat him through brute force by going, "Hey, vampires, y'all are really strong. Go fight,
really
go attack." And yeah, they are. They're practically unstoppable, especially the likes of Abarash and them. But
don't think that Neferata didn't create something fucking awesome. She did.
Yeah, they can easily take like anything, pretty much. But there's only so many of them, and they get outnumbered in a lot of those fights. And Alcadazar's military genius, he knows the vampires are very strong, So he isolates them. He isolates them, uses genius tactics that gets them surrounded, and they die. A lot of them.
And you got to remember as well that the mortuary priests, of which there is an enormous cult that are obviously against these dudes, they can use light magic as well. And that magic is not particularly friendly to undead. So they're a very powerful set of magic users as well. So don't think that the vampires are going to have an easy time of it here. They may be physically extraordinary. And at this point, they don't have the same issues that modern vampires have. So they are much better. They're wandering around during the day. They're having themselves a good old laugh at the expense of what they think are going to be their very dead enemies. But as we say, Alcatazar is actually a very, very, very good and capable general and dominates the first wave. Utterly dominates it.
Yeah. So Nagash like flat out loses the war.
Flat out.
Like Archon the Black, he's very powerful, but he can't be everywhere at once. And there are individuals that can go toe to toe with him. Like Grand Hierophant Kotep by this point, like really knows what he's doing because the mortuary cult has also increased in power over those last 300 years. Although like they're able to take what they learned fighting against Nagash and apply it to their own magics. So they have also gotten much more powerful. And like you have, and there's also a lot more of them. Like the mortuary cult has tons and tons of lich priests, and they are able to actively fight against these really powerful wizards.
It's also worth saying that we focus on the mortuary cult, but we look at the overall picture. There is a lot of gods with them anyway.
Yeah, at least 12, but probably more.
Indeed, and probably more. They have a. It says in the army list alone that it's not just those ones. They've got thousands of smaller gods as well, in the same way that the Empire does come modern times. And all of these are working very much on the side of the as yet to be land of the dead, and they are pushing back hard against what is ultimately one of the biggest perversions of life that exist, because these are actual undead and nobody likes this. It gives everybody the creeps, from the gods right down to the smallest mortal. So bye-bye Nagash, you have lost. Except Nagash is Nagash. He's also a bit of a genius because he also has a plan sitting at the back of his mind, which
there is one more critical thing that happens, which is when Nagash fully loses against Alcatazar, it's the vampires.
Don't forget that one.
Because Nagash fucked up. And the whole, like we said, Vashanesh, to his credit, is a genius as well. Like Neferata and Vashanesh are the two big vampires, I really think. And Neferata does not want to be involved with this. She hates Nagash. Not only did this is like the third time in her life a man has completely fucked her over. She's over it. And her and Vashanesh are scheming about how to get away from him. And Vashanesh figures out the ring only binds the vampires to Nagash if Vashanesh is alive. If he's dead, it doesn't work. So what Vashanesh does is he kind of manipulates his way, likely kind of manipulating Archon into saying, oh, let me kill Alcatazar. I'm unstoppable. I can't die. I am almost as good at fighting as Abarash is. I'm almost as good at sorcery as Wazoran. I'm like, I'm kind of the jack of all trades here. I'll take care of him. And Archon goes, all right, cool. So Vashanesh goes to war with Alcatazar, and there's actually a funny note of like, Vashanesh starts dueling with him and kind of realizes that, I could kill this guy, but he doesn't. And he fights with him. And then once Alcatazar is like, goes in for a big kill shot, Vashanesh goes, he just doesn't defend himself. So Alcatazar decapitates him and Vashanesh dies. And the second he dies, all the vampires feel it. They all feel, because Vashanesh knew Nagash would be suspicious and Archon would be suspicious. So he really tries to play it off as, oh no, I totally died for real. And Alcatazar beat me because he just beat me. Not, he couldn't just commit suicide. It'd be too obvious. So he dies and all the vampires flee. They scatter to the winds. And Nagash gets fucking furious.
Curse time!
Yeah, and the only one that comes back is Zoran. Literally, and like his little acolytes. So of the 7 bloodlines, all but one abandon him, and they all scatter to the winds. And Vashanesh played it off very well, where he dies, and when he resurrects, he immediately takes off the ring, and Nagash doesn't know he's alive. Nagash thinks that Alcatazar not only killed him, but took his body and probably threw it in a sacred fire or something, and killed him. So Vashanesh fades into the shadows. The other vampires are gone, and this is when Nagash unleashes the big curse.
Plague time.
Yeah, well, first he does the sunlight curse, which is hilarious.
Oh, the big curse and the vampires. No, point taken. Yes.
Yeah, please
curse,
walk us through that.
Take that. So he curses the vampires, the fuckers, for betraying him. You can no longer go out in the sun. And arguably, much like Nagash and the issues that he has with Petra setting up the sun god, he passes that down onto all of his followers, the vampires, and goes, there you go, you fuckers, that's what you get for betraying me.
He literally downgrades their immortality. He's like, no, I'm taking your sunlight card, you don't get this anymore.
You've got the undead trait, do you? Well, let's now add the sun burns you trait, you fuckers, because you've got the undead trait and I control you, and then adds that. So yeah, that's the first step towards vampires becoming much more like the modern day vampires that we know.
Yeah, so hey, make sure everyone you thank Nagash that vampires are much easier to deal with these days.
Yeah, it's all because of Nagash. Other than that, you could argue that Neferata, regardless of the propaganda that spread around, did a freaking good job of getting themselves an effective case of immortality. Yeah.
But like Andy said, so Nagash had a plan B, because although Nagash thought he was going to win, when he finds out that he loses, he gets vindictive as fuck. Because
Nagash.
Yeah, Nagash at this point goes, he literally pulls the classic move of, okay, if I can't have Nehekara, no one gets Nehekara. And he does the most bitch move ever seen, which is that...
there's a lovely little bit, because you've got yourself an opponent who is an extraordinary general. So what do? You're given an opponent you can't fight.
Yeah. So Nagash, and the version I've read of this that I love the most is that Nagash goes to his forge in Nagashazar, and he takes a bunch of warpstone and he creates a little series of these little tokens, and he pours every single death curse and disease and just the most horrible shit he can possibly conjure with all of his knowledge of dark magic and necromancy and everything that he's learned. And he just makes the most horrible things possible. And he calls Archon. He goes, take these and go to the source of the Great River Vitae and dump them.
So Vitae stops being the River of Vitae, the River of Life, and becomes the River of Ruin. It goes bad. And it doesn't just curse the water itself. It curses pretty much everything around it. And people start to die. As we said, an enemy that Al-Qadazar can't fight. Diseased.
Yeah. And so it becomes the Great River Mortis. And to this day, by the way, it is so toxic, even all these thousands of years later, that it quite literally, if you touch it, you will die.
Yeah, it runs red. It's absolutely disgusting. It's not a good thing. Thanks, Nagash.
Yeah, and like Andy said, it spreads. Like it literally unleashes magical disease and contagion, and nothing could stop it.
Yeah, totally. And it's one of those ones that, because this came from an earlier version of Warhammer in its first iterants, so we're talking 4th edition, because this was first mentioned in 1994 in terms of when it first popped up, there wasn't that desperate need whenever you bring up the word plague to immediately then say, well, it must be to do with Nurgle or the Skaven. Quite the opposite. It's very much Nagash. It was his plan. He unleashed a plague. God damn it. And that's it.
Yeah, he doesn't need their help.
He doesn't need Chaos Gods, nor does he need the Skaven to do this. This is well within his remit. You're after all dealing with a land that's known for its big plagues, its big swarms, its various issues.
Yeah, they've dealt with problems like these.
Yeah, totally. So Nagash pretty much kills everyone.
Yep. And the most sinister thing is there's one particular caveat that he added to the curse, is that he made it where there would be one person on the planet who was completely immune.
Doctor Strange is sitting there looking at him.
Yeah. So Al-Qadazar starts to realize that he is not getting sick. His family gets sick. His soldiers get sick. Everyone's dying around him, and he can't die. Like he's fine. He's super healthy, because Nagash is so spiteful about Al-Qadazar defeating him that he refuses to let him die. It even goes so far as to say Nagash is using his sorcery back in Nagashazar to protect Al-Qadazar from everything, to make sure he won't die. and Alcatazar loses himself to grief, like because I'm like,
grim.
Yeah, it's the most horrible thing imaginable is everyone dying to a horrible disease. And he's the only he's literally the last man alive in Khemri.
Step 1 towards Land of the Dead.
Yeah. And Nagash, to be extra spiteful at this point, he is so done with the living of Nehekara that he then calls Archon up and he goes, okay, I want you to go out and I want you to resurrect every corpse that you find. And I want you to kill everything. Kill every man, kill every woman, kill every child, kill every animal, kill every plant. I want this land dead.
Yep. So he didn't really lose the war. He just lost the first round. Come round 2, Nagash 100% wins and eventually marches into Khemri and takes Alcatazar in chains.
Yep. Archon arrests him and Alcatazar doesn't even fight. Like he's literally just sitting on his throne waiting to die.
Utterly broken.
Yeah. So they take him back to Nagashazar. So Nagash he's brought before Nagash, and Nagash, in very over-the-top villainous detail, explains exactly what he's going to do to Alcatazar, and even tells him what he's about to do, which is Nagash came to a conclusion after the vampires betrayed him. And this is a really core thing to his character. A lot of people think that Nagash is like really stupid or a cartoon villain and does silly things, but there's a core thing to Nagash, which a lot of it is fear and spite beneath his pride.
And often as well, you'll find with him, just to add an extra detail there, that it's often progressive in that he has a plan, something happens, and he makes a new plan. And it's not the one that he had originally. He looks at it and he goes, no, because this has happened, I'm now doing this. And each time when he suffers a defeat, he inches up a little bit in terms of his megalomaniacal plan making.
Yeah. So what Nagash comes to a decision about after the vampires so he unleashes the plague and he's kind of brooding for a bit. And what Nagash decides is this world is flawed. And as long as every time I try and trust anyone, except for Archon, anytime I give anyone the slightest bit of free will, they backstab me. They fail me. They fuck me over every single time. So you know what I'm going to do? If I take the entire planet and I just kill everyone, there will be no free will but mine. And then everything will be perfect.
Yep.
No one can betray me. No one can fight me. There will be no more. And there's also, Nagash is very insane by this point because of his megalomania.
I wouldn't say he's insane. I'd say that he's quite sane, and from his own perspective, from our perspective, he's utterly insane.
I do think Nagash also very much sees it as there will be no pain, there will be no suffering other than those I want to suffer. Like the world will be better. There won't be gods jerking us around and manipulating us.
I think that's the big one, actually, because he comes from a place where the mortuary cult, depending on which version, not just mortuary cult, but the gods, depending on which version of the Covenant you read, loosely speaking, the Nehekaran people believed that they'd made a deal to worship these gods in return for various magics and intelligence and all the rest of it. But worship was core to that. And he came into the mortuary cult that said worshipping these gods are important. And he came to despise that and realized that it was a lie from his perspective. You could get power from a completely different place. The gods dick people around. And by this point, he's old. He has probably seen the waxing and waning of the winds of magic at various points, the arrival of an Everchosen that swirls around, does stuff, and then goes. And that's freaking dangerous. And that can only come about because of the gods. If you take away all of those souls that are messing around with the aether, suddenly it all becomes calm and there is no danger.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said in that. Nagash is kind of the first character that I'm aware of that ends up figuring out what Archaon later becomes obsessed with, which is this idea of the gods suck and the moral right thing to do is to choke them to death, to starve them out so that they can't fuck with anything anymore because they don't deserve to. They're monsters.
It's also fair to say that Nagash himself by this point is very much of the opinion that he is a god. And is that's not true. It's that he thinks he is no less than the gods. He thinks that the gods are horrendous manipulating creatures, but etheric entities that deserve nothing but scorn. Somewhat like the Dark Elves have got a certain level of scorn towards, say, the Chaos Gods. And he has nothing but scorn for these things and considers himself to be better than the gods. And in many respects, effectively, a god. He is worshipped at this point as a god by possibly hundreds of thousands of people. If you're looking at just the classic sense of how the Aether forms round, he's already on his first steps towards true ascension, actually becoming a god himself. But he, from his perspective, wants to become a material one within the material world, not one that lies off on the etheric side.
Yeah, which, depending on how your moral compass goes when you're enjoying a fictional universe, a lot of people might agree with him.
Yeah, they might.
And so Nagash comes up with, and I've talked about this in my top 5 spells video, which we did some really cool little cinematic stuff for if you want to go watch. Nagash comes up with genuinely one of the most powerful spells that will ever be cast in the entirety of Warhammer Fantasy history.
Yeah.
And that he legit comes up with a spell that will kill everything on the planet, or at least most things on the planet, and then it will resurrect everything that is dead so he can wipe out whatever's left. And then he will be it. He will be Alpha and Omega. He's it.
It's worth stating that there's a couple of different versions of the first attempt at the Great Ritual in terms of how it was presented. In its very first iteration, he attempts to do almost the entire world, and that just doesn't come to pass. In later iterations, it's often, I'm going to do it to the land of the dead and use them as my first army for spreading out across the world. And that's loosely where it's kind of landed now.
To be fair, ultimately it doesn't really matter if he successfully resurrected all the dead in the land of the dead, which, remember, we're talking about a culture that preserved the dead so carefully that the cities of the dead were grossly overpopulated and larger than the cities of the living. And this was a huge civilization.
Massive necropolises.
So if he had succeeded in resurrecting all the dead in Nehekara, he would have been unstoppable. Well,
he pretty much did.
Yeah. So onto the ritual. So this ritual, it actually takes a while to cast because the Skaven figure out what he's doing. At this point, Clanishan goes, hey, he's doing some weird shit. And they see what happens to Nehekara, and it scares the shit out of them. And they hilariously
the Council of 13 when you see this shit going down.
One of my favorite things that the Skaven very logically deduce that, okay, Nagash hates us only a little less than he hated all these other guys. So if he's going to take over the world, that includes us getting fucked. So we need to do something.
Yeah, they absolutely do. And they've not been doing nothing, which is worth making clear. The Skaven have been preparing for trying to take out Nagash for quite a long time, and they've come up with not a great deal. They've come up with plans because they're Skaven, and more plans.
And 13 constantly voting against each other. Yeah.
You get how it is. And this has been going on for centuries. And then the awareness of what's coming becomes more and more of a pressure as we then move towards him attempting his great ritual. The enormous consumption of warpstone that's about to occur. The enormous ritual that he's about to do. And they get fucking desperate. And now they've already got a couple of potential routes, and they choose one of them, which is to get a sword that none of them are willing to carry. Not one of them. They're not willing to touch it, nor are they willing to go anywhere near Nagash because he's too scary. They know he'll die. No matter who they send at him, they know they will die. So they just push it on someone else.
Yeah, and I think it's worth also noting that when Nagash starts his ritual, it is so strong that literally every single god in the Warhammer universe goes, whoa, what is that guy doing?
And it succeeds.
It starts going off very well. And the Skaven, to their credit, like the Grey Seers freak the fuck out when the ritual starts because they can feel it. Half the planet away, they can feel the ritual going off. And because it's that strong, like the Slann over in Lustria are going, whoa, what is happening? Like everyone that is very magically attuned, probably a lot of mystics started losing their shit. Like it was probably scary. No matter where you were in the world, people started going, what is happening? And nobody could stop him. Yeah. He was that strong. And there's even a whole thing of the Chaos Gods are literally screeching at Nagash, and he's laughing because he goes, I have locked this shit down. I'm in the material world. I have all this power. You can't stop me.
Yeah, and it is a truly tremendous ritual. Now, depending on which source you use, you get a slightly different version of what's about to occur. If you use the current 8th edition Khemri army list, the Tomb King army list, it's got a slightly simplified version where they don't even really mention the Skaven, other than the
Which
mysteriously happens. Okay, and they say that the ritual didn't really work. But if you look at every other source, he finishes the ritual. He actually completes it. His job was to turn all of the Land of the Dead into the Land of the Dead. 100% successful, done. And then as he leans back, he collapses. Or alternatively, the Tomb King version, where he's caught just before he finishes. And it's up to yourself which one you think is the more likely.
Yeah, I think my favorite version is that he does succeed. I think in the Tomb King 8th book, it says it succeeds in like waves, where it's like he awakens all the regular dead, and then his ritual starts seeping into all the tombs, and it slowly starts waking up the various kings and such. But like Cetra, for instance, does not wake up.
Yeah, there's only one that doesn't wake up, etc. Because
it's
the enormous amount of magic. Yeah, the wards have been put in place. It's so
but like
cool.
Everyone else starts waking up, and they all start marching towards Nagashazar, this army that's so massive it's impossible to imagine.
Yeah, now you got to remember that not everybody is actually under his control here, because there's one group of people that aren't. The mortuary cult. They're not been entirely
they're not dead.
And they're not strictly speaking undead. And you've got to keep that in your mind, because they are watching effectively all of their people now go. And that's a thing to watch, isn't it? As everyone's waking up everywhere. What? Green eyes burning, because this is the first time we've got proper necromancy that's taking out an entire, not just realm, it's beyond a realm. It's a whole empire has just been woken up.
Yeah, and at this point, the Skaven perform probably what I imagine was terrifying, but from an outside perspective would be hilarious to watch, which is that the Council of 13, for the first time and debatably, I think the only time in existence, comes to a unanimous vote, which is plan Fellblade.
Plan Fellblade!
So they create next to, I think, the Sword of Cain and Galmaraz, the deadliest weapon in existence.
Much more deadly than Galmaraz if you go by the Warhammer rules. It is by far the most powerful weapon in the 3rd edition and 4th edition and 5th edition of the game, pretty much.
Yeah, I would agree, actually. I would agree, though it comes with a hell of a caveat, which is, as really Andy was saying, nobody wants to touch it because it's instant cancer.
It kills you. It's bad, man. But there is somebody who's currently in Nagashazar who's not just desperate, he's broken and insane and pretty much good to go.
Yeah. Also, if you want a hilarious mental image, there's a note that the Skaven forge it in Skaven Blight, and then they have to use a relay system of runners, not cavalry, runners, to run it from Skaven Blight to Nagashazar as fast as they can, which is hysterical.
It is.
Very impressive. Very impressive move on the Skaven's part. But yeah, so they get the Fellblade to Nagashazar because the Skaven realize, like Andy said, there is someone who was stupid enough from the Skaven's position to wield it, because they rationalize this guy is broken. He hates Nagash. We just gotta point him. And
so I think there's something else that's worth mentioning here, just to make sure that we don't do the thing that's very easy to do, and that's just read the words and reiterate them. We're here to try and give you a bit more context as well, to try and explain that
lead box, not obsidian box, lead box.
Yeah, indeed. Why the hell didn't they just give it to a Clan-Eshin assassin and let him do the job? Because let's be honest, it might be better than Al-Qadazar at the job, given that he's currently broken in a cell. And it really does speak to this weapon and just how horrendous it is. It requires someone who's so thoroughly broken, so insanely filled with the need for revenge to kill Nagash, to have the ability to even touch it. It is a horrendous weapon. Absolutely terrible. The Skaven have poured all of their hate into what they hope will be a god-killing weapon.
Yeah, and it's just pure warpstone. Like there's literally no other material. It's pure refined to the deadliest point. Like this thing could borderline probably cut through reality if it really wanted to.
Yeah, it's a strength 10 weapon doing D6 wounds per hit. It absolutely sucks.
Like it's
I have gone against that weapon in games of Warhammer multiple times, and it sucked.
It's one of those weapons that, like, if a writer was like, yeah, this thing can perma-kill demons, I'd be like, yeah, okay. Like but in any event, it's also worth saying that no Skaven are innately cowardly creatures.
Yeah.
And A, just facing down Nagash is probably impossible for a Skaven. And B, just holding the Fellblade would be impossible for a Skaven.
Yeah.
At least in this time. Obviously, there are Skaven later who will, but I don't think they really realize what it is in later generations.
Quite. And you've also got to remember that different writers will take different tacks on how these weapons can be used. And when you move towards the end times, when the world is filled with magic, they'll create all manner of reasons why certain things that previously couldn't happen suddenly can.
Yeah, and so they break into Alcatrazar's cell. Mm-hmm. He has no idea what a Skaven is. He's never seen one. This random rat man breaks in and just lays a box in front of him and he's like, just pick it up, go. And he doesn't understand what he literally thinks it's a trick by Nagash. He thinks that like Nagash is like fucking with him or whatever. And the Skaven, eventually he does open it, and when he picks up the Fellblade, there's one other notable enchantment on it, which is that the Council of 13 and the Greyseer clan, all 169 of them, are able to kind of influence him a little bit. They can kind of compel, they're like, go this way.
They give him the direction towards Nagash, basically.
Yeah, and they are putting in his head as best they can, go to Nagash. And he wants to.
Which is something he wants to do anyway.
He embraces it.
He's just seen his entire civilization wiped out by Nagash's hand. His need for vengeance, his hatred of Nagash is quite simply beyond compare.
Yeah. So he makes his way to Nagash's throne room. Thanks to the Skaven's help, they make him they kill anything that needs to be killed on the way there. They help him avoid Archon the Black and all this other stuff. And he finds Nagash sitting in his throne, looking like he's dead, because Nagash is fucking exhausted.
Yep. I mean, he has just done pretty much the most powerful spell that's arguably gone off for probably since the first coming of Chaos. Maybe the Vortex.
Yeah. And he runs up to him and goes, let's do this. And Nagash, one of the best parts is Nagash, somewhere deep down, either because of his equipment or just because of who he is, Nagash gains enough awareness to go, something's about to hit me. And he raises up his hand and his hand gets chopped off. And then he battles with Alcatrazar. And it is one of my favorite battles in Warhammer Fantasy history, because even with his hand chopped off, and the Fellblade, the second it chops off his hand, those runes are eating into his very soul.
And what's pretty cool as well, the initial description of that, and when the hand falls down, Nagash by this point is so consumed by Warpstone and so undead and powerful, the hand literally skitters away. It goes away like it just come out of an Evil Dead movie.
Yeah, it's described as like a giant spider that crawls away, which very important for later. But
very important for
his
later.
hand crawls away, and Nagash just starts unleashing on Alcatrazar. And the other thing
Council 13.
The other aspect of the Fellblade is that it allows the Council of 13 to try and protect Alcatrazar. And the Council of 13, very, very powerful. They have the entire Greyseer clan, 13 times 13, 169 members, using everything. And y'all know how powerful Greyseers are. They're pretty strong. They're all together. They're chanting. They block Nagash's first spell. Half the Greyseer clan drops dead instantly.
Yep.
Because like their brains just explode.
It's worth saying that at this point, Nagash is effectively as close to a material god as you can get. He's probably, by this point, maybe as much as the most powerful spellcaster almost around the world. Now, we can argue this, and probably should do at some point, because there are so many candidates for that. And I could probably say exactly the same thing for several other candidates. But regardless, at this point, Nagash is insanely powerful. but is also at his very, very weakest to show just how insanely powerful he actually is. And he is still wiping out half the Grey Seers that are out there pretty much with a movement of his hand, as every single spell that they can possibly throw to try and protect him start to collapse. Alcatazar is pretty much their only hope. Unfortunately,
yeah, he literally barbarian rages.
Yeah.
And he just, like, it's literally said he wields, I mean, the Fellblade is pretty powerful, and he literally just goes nuts, and he chops Nagash into a bunch of tiny pieces.
Yes, he does.
And Nagash is just raging, but there's nothing he can do. Like, it just breaks him down.
Dude's dead. And Skaven come swooping in, pick up all the pieces they can, and throw those into fires that will
warp
burn
forges, no
and
less.
never come
Like,
back.
They're warp flame forges.
Yeah, totally. They're gone. As far as the Skaven are concerned, that's him dead forever. However, that claw got away, and the crown, which was sitting upon Nagash's fell brow, is taken by Alcatazar.
Yeah, because he stumbles out the room. Because the Skaven don't care about him. They're just worried about Nagash, and because they're, they very, very reasonably are afraid Nagash can put himself back together very quickly. So Alcatazar wanders out of the fortress, where he different versions of the story differ, but most versions seem to say that he falls into a river and he drowns because his body is so drained.
He throws the Fellblade away first down into a crevasse beside there, but he either A, staggers away a bit and finds himself on the other side of the mountains and then dies, or he falls in a river and he dies, or he trips up and he dies. The important thing is he's dead.
Yeah, and he has the Crown of Sorcery. He has it with him, and he literally dies clutching it. And yeah, like Andy said, all of Nagash's body gets thrown into a furnace. And I think if Nagash's hand had not gotten away and the crown had been thrown in, I do think this would have been his actual death.
Yes, the Skaven would have succeeded. They didn't succeed because of Nagash's preparation and because of his extraordinary power, in that they had to do an awful lot to kill him. And those two last bits, the Skaven couldn't know for certain, but they gave it a damn good go. They tried.
Yeah.
And failed.
Yeah. So the claw of Nagash gets away, and Nagash is literally one of those characters where he's like Sauron, right? He's Warhammer Fantasy Sauron in a lot of ways.
Yes.
As long as there is some piece of him still in the world, he will be back. So now we can actually skip ahead a pretty lengthy amount of time, because in a lot of versions of the story, because his hand is still around and the Crown of Sorcery is still around, his body that is destroyed goes up into the atmosphere as ash, and all this ash gets carried along a wind, and it starts making its way back to the Black Pyramid, and it goes in and it starts collecting in his sarcophagus.
Drip.
And it just, drip by drip.
Takes 1,111 years.
Which
it's not a short process.
Yeah.
It's not a short process.
And we're not even going to touch on what happens with the crown, because it doesn't
all
matter.
We need to say for all of that is that the crown ends up elsewhere. The claw is pretty much gone. The lands of the dead are largely the lands of the dead that we will come to know later. Because Nagash died, they all fell out of his control, and the vast majority of them are now awake. A bunch of them are mindless automatons. They don't really have much character. A bunch of them have all their character, definitely those that are properly prepared by the mortuary cult. And the lands of the dead fall into massive civil war, which eventually comes to an end when the head of the mortuary cult goes, Cetra, come back and let's bind everything together.
Yeah, which poor Katep. that was not a fun day for him, I think.
No,
but
it wasn't.
Yeah, so Nagash returns.
I have failed.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting the Skaven take over Nagashazar. Clan
I can't remember. Don't ask me.
It's something that is very deady sounding. Like it's like Mortis but Skavenized. I forget which clan it is.
It's not Morskatar.
Necris. I think it's Necris.
Maybe Nigel. I can't recall off the top of my head.
Anyway,
I'm not even going to try.
Very cool Skaven clan. They're very like bone. They wear like a lot of skeleton bones, and they're very spooky. And Clan, no, it's not Mordkin. Clan Mordkin? That might be it.
I don't want to say it's one
anyway,
or another.
It doesn't matter. It's a Skaven clan. They actually get on the Council of 13 because they're so powerful. and they're insanely strong because they still have all that warp stone and they keep mining it.
And it is an enormous quantity that's still there. Don't think that this is a small amount of warp stone. Nagash has been both extremely frugal and also very careful with what he's used. And he thought he had enough to probably last himself forever. But I think we're now moving to approximately minus 40 Imperial calendar when Nagash goes ping
and wakes up. And his waking up is it's what the night of the restless dead, but
nope, that's the second time he wakes up.
Oh, that's the second time. Okay, so the first time he wakes up, he goes, oh no, this is Sigmar stuff, isn't it?
Oh yeah, we're about to hit Sigmar stuff, but
so he
starts
up
off down in the lands of the dead, obviously.
Right. So he wakes up, and this is when an event happens called the Wars of the Dead. So Nagash wakes up, and remember, he lives in Kimry, Black Pyramid. So Nagash wakes up, he goes outside, and his hand doesn't regenerate. But he goes outside, he doesn't have his magic equipment, he doesn't have any of his stuff, but he's still insanely strong. And he walks outside and he goes, okay, I'm back, I'm gonna take over. But as soon as he does that, he goes, hey, who's in charge of Kimry now? And he finally, at long last, meets Cetra. And Cetra literally has that moment of, I've heard a lot about you, and I'm really fucking pissed. And I think in some ways, Cetra probably got a little bit of perverse joy out of finding out that Nagash was not fully dead, because that meant he got to kick Nagash's ass.
Yeah. So this is a fun time, because this is the moment when you go, haha, Nagash, is he a god? The answer is no. He is a very powerful necromancer. He has come back, but he's massively weakened. He doesn't have his crown, which holds a part of his essence. He doesn't have his claw, which also holds a part of his essence. And when he comes back, he's more than powerful enough to say, right, all you undead that I did bring back, you should come to my side. But they're also more than powerful enough to say, yeah, no. Yeah, and it turns into a proper war, because he is powerful enough to get a lot of them. Arguably, some of them fall to his side because they just don't like Cetra.
Yeah, and there are Tomb Kings that actively side with him. Like, they have enough willpower, and they're like, yeah, no, Cetra sucks. This Nagash guy is going to let us do other things. Let's team up with him.
But it's a short-lived war.
Yeah, it's Cetra. Yeah. And this is when Nagash versus Cetra is actually a really fun fight, because Nagash thinks he's unstoppable because of his sorcery, and he comes up against Cetra, and he beats one of the most powerful anti-magic items and like one of the most important relics in the Warhammer Fantasy universe, which is the Brooch of Usirian, which is this cool little thing that Cetra wears that literally makes him fucking immune to magic.
Yeah, that brooch is bonkers. Love it.
Yeah, and so he throws the most powerful spells he can think of at Cetra, and they just bounce. And Cetra is on his chariot, and he just, every time they fight, he beelines for Nagash, and Nagash runs away because he can't fight Cetra. Cetra will body him.
But fortunately, he's got somewhere he reckons he can go back to. His old house, back at Nagashazar. That's a good place to retreat to, right? That's going to be great. That was where his enormous empire was, but it has been 1,111 years. And how much warpstone do you think can be mined in 1,111 years? I'll give you a chance to take a guess at that bit.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah, so he goes home, and he's a little upset. Yeah, but he does home. Is this when he takes the fortress in a single night?
By himself, pretty much. Yeah. He walks up and goes, haha, Skaven, it's time to kick ass and chew gum, and I'm all out of gum. It's revenge time.
Yeah, there's a hilarious note of this from the Skaven perspective. A lone wanderer walks up to their gates and goes, let me in. And they all go, ha, 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 and they bring all their weapons and stuff. And then the entire a council of 13 clan, the entire clan is massacred in a single night.
Yeah, and I think that you've got to ensure that we try and then compare what happens here with what happened down in the land of the dead. It gives you an idea of how much of a war broke out down there, how much power the land of the dead has now in comparison to what it had when it was first summoned up by Nagash. But also when we move back to Nagash being up at Nagashazar, yes, it's his home and he knows the secret ways to get in to make sure that the door's open, but he's still one dude by himself and he completely takes it. Yes, he's got some potential new allies who are like, hey, God's back. Brilliant. Still, the enormous amount of power that he brings to the table just by being himself. This is not your typical Warhammer character. This is a one-man, not army, but almost a one-man realm.
Yeah, one-man faction. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, so he wipes out the Skaven, and like Andy said, he gets to his Warpstone deposit and sees it's gone. And yeah.
Warpstone.
So once again, plan fucked up. He now has to follow, because he, in his mind, he was going to come get his Warpstone, get what artifacts he could find of his old stuff, and then go back and fight maybe Nehekar some more. And at this point, he realizes, shit, I can't do that. So he starts feeling out tendrils, and then he seizes on something, and he goes, I need my crown. That's what I need. If I can get my crown back, I'll be strong enough. And so he starts building up. He makes himself a new hand out of a lot of really nasty
new iron claw, which is really awesome, and it allows him to wield his big, mighty, massive sword of avenging justice.
Yep, he gets his sword back. He gets, I believe he gets his staff back and his armor as well.
And he does. So clearly that is all some point regained at here somehow. The obvious thing is that it was still there and the Skaven refused to touch it, but it seems so super unlike the Skaven.
Yeah, I imagine they probably tried to destroy it and just couldn't.
Yeah,
like, into the forge or locked away and...
There's definitely something weird going on here, and it's not really given a very clear answer, but he gets his shit back, and he just wants his crown, possibly his claw if he can find the fucking thing.
Yeah. So he gathers Archon the Black to him. He gathers a big army, and he starts just feeling out for the crown, and he senses it somewhere north. So he starts wandering up. And this is where we actually get a very pivotal scene for Nagash, where as he's on his way, he senses another powerful presence. And he goes, oh, that's weird. In the, I think the Middle Mountains. And he follows it and he finds a burial tomb of a warrior named Krell.
So that's in the Grey Mountains, the Mount of Krell.
Grey Mountains, that's where he went.
Beside a big, huge glacial lake.
So he didn't go this way, he went that way.
Yeah, indeed. So he's making his way northwards. He ends up making a base in an old elven room.
I thought Krell gets buried in the Grey Mountains after. Because that's the glacial. That's the glacial lake tomb.
No, you're right. It is afterwards. Because then he gets woken up again on the
at his first tomb, his like chaos tomb is either in the Middle Mountains or the World's Edge Mountains.
I don't want to say which because I'm going to be wrong again. So let's just say in the mountains. And this is where, once again, like Andy was saying earlier, we get a scene that shows how powerful the Tomb Kings are and also shows how powerful Nagash is. And that he sees Krell and he goes, this guy would be awesome. Like this would be a perfect champion for me. I'm going to bring this point up that I'm thinking in a second, but he decides he wants Krell, but there's a problem. Krell's soul is in possession of Khorne. And there is a note that Krell is not necessarily super thrilled with Khorne because he was promised an eternity of battle. And when he died, Khorne was disappointed, despite the fact that he destroyed an entire dwarffold, which is nuts. But despite all that, when Krell died, Khorne did not give him that. He just kind of cast him aside and was like, you failed me, you suck. The end. Chaos gods suck in general for that exact same reason.
So Nagash reaches out to Krell's soul and says, hey, you should come work for me. You should be my champion. I will give you a genuine eternity of battle in the material world. Not even that like lame Khorne shit. Like you can kill whatever you want. Just come serve me. And Krell says, okay, but my soul belongs to a god, like not only a god, debatably in many people's view, the most powerful of just gods. Khorne is big. So Nagash rolls up his sleeves and he fights Khorne for Krell's soul. And he wins.
Gotta love his understanding of the soul and exactly how it works. There is no other character, arguably, in the entire Warhammer world that is more capable of fucking around with souls. So, yeah, that's a thing. Yeah, and it's also worth noting that as Nagash is doing his wandering north as well, the Skaven make an attempt to retake good old Nagashazar, but Archon the Black kicks them the fuck in.
Yeah, and like the scene that's described in the books for the resurrection of Krell is very awesome because it's like literally the skies are like exploding with magic and there's black lightning flashing everywhere and anyone nearby is like, oh god, and everyone runs away because it looks like the apocalypse because the chaos gods are arguing with Nagash, but Nagash rules lawyers them into giving him Krell's soul.
Pretty much. One of the great joys of Nagash in comparison to the Chaos Gods is that Nagash works within the material realm, the mortal realms, and the mortal realms have got physical laws. Actual laws. When you're beyond into the aether, you're into the realm of emotion, imagination, and potential. But when you're working the material realm, you're working by a set of established rules, which means if you get the correct ritual, you do the correct thing, you are going to, hopefully, get the outcome that you're looking for. And Nagash is better in the material realm than any god. Any god. And was almost certain to win this one. It was pride, you could argue, that meant that Krell was lost by good old Khorne.
Yeah. So Krell wakes up and Krell, like Archon the Black, is insanely loyal to Nagash, but Archon at least has thoughts, and like he has a little bit of a will where he sometimes will do things without Nagash's necessary approval because he thinks it'll help Nagash in the long run and other stuff like that. Krell is disturbingly loyal to Nagash. Krell is, I think, like there are very few times we actually get to kind of see inside Krell's mind, but every single time Krell is said to be like, he's almost automaton levels of loyal to Nagash because Nagash goes into the bargain.
Replaced Khorne with Nagash. He's effectively a zealot.
Yep. So
it's not even loyal. It's beyond loyalty. It's faith.
Yep. So this is where we get the awesome Sigmar throwdown where Nagash comes over the mountains. He's got a huge army of the undead he's been building up. He resurrects Krell. He resurrects Krell's Barrow Legion, which is a terrifying legion of Khornate undead. He has got Archon the Black with him in the Sigmar books. He also has vampires with him, but that doesn't make any fucking sense. He does call the vampires to him.
Yeah, he does.
And they don't answer.
So it's worth saying that there's two clean versions of this. There's the one that's presented inside the army lists, and there's also the Legends version that was presented by Graham
for the
McNeil
Sigmar storyline.
Yeah, totally, for the Sigmar storyline, and they're quite different. Graham McNeil went in quite a different direction with how he portrayed it and how he portrayed Nagash's army pretty much being across the entirety of the Empire, attacking everywhere. He also, as I recall, originally put the crown up in Brass Keep up in the Middle Mountains, which Sigmar went up, bopped the person who had it, and took that crown and yanked it down to Reitdorf. The storyline was originally pitched as almost that back in the 4th edition of Warhammer as well. So that didn't change too much, but the amount of forces that Nagash brings to bear and the nature of the war that takes place is significantly different between the two different versions. So it's worth saying that in a classic. If you want to go look it up, if you read the novel version, you're going to get a completely different style of story to the ones you get in, say, the 4th to 8th edition of the armies.
Yeah, in the Black Library novel and kind of like the army books, it is kind of an apocalyptically sized army, but there are differences of that. In the Black Library books, there are some vampires that turn up. They're a little weird, but there are 2 vampire generals. Whereas in the army books, it states that no vampires show up, which plays into something, which we'll get into that in a second.
Yeah, absolutely. And the nature of the fight as well. In the army list, it's pretty much they head to Reichdorf, which is modern day Altdorf, and they have a giant apocalyptic fight.
Yeah, on the battle of the River Reich.
The Battle of the indeed. Where if you look at the novel, that's just one part of an enormous war that goes across the entirety of the Empire, as most of the tribes are all attacked simultaneously by undead to ensure that Sigmar can't call for help, to ensure that he's massively weakened for when Nagash then drives through. It's quite a different scale in terms of how.
Yeah, pretty much the entire Southern Empire is wrapped up in a fight.
And even Middenheim.
It's fun read. Yeah,
so right up the north.
Graham
McNeil's always awesome. And even Middenheim up in the north is attacked during that period. And yeah, they're quite different, but ultimately it's the same process, which is eventually Nagash gets to have himself a hoedown with Sigmar.
Yeah, they have an epic battle. It's awesome. And there are a lot of really cool characters we all know and love show up. You've got like Alaric the Mads there with High King Kurgan Ironbeard, because when they find out Krell's back, the dwarves are very upset because they're like, we already crossed him out of the book. He can't be here. Grimble Ironhelm already killed him. Why is he still back? So it's a huge fight. The dwarves get involved. The Empire is on its knees, and Sigmar somehow, I love the way Graham handles it, but like they have a big fight and Sigmar kills Nagash. Miraculously. It's regardless of the version, it's miraculous that he beats Nagash.
Yeah, in the novel, he's pretty much going to lose. It's reached the point where there's only as I recall, 100 left, and they're paralleling through, and Sigmar's trying to reach Nagash. And what he does is he eventually uses he's aware that Nagash is interested in only one thing, and that's the crown.
Yeah, because Nagash does try to parlay in the.
Okay, and this is the big one. Sigmar puts it on.
Yeah, okay.
which is huge.
Yeah,
and I think this is a stream to discuss all in of itself, because whoever puts that crown on is filled with Nagash's thoughts. And what is Nagash obsessed with? Becoming a god. What happens to Sigmar?
Ooh, I've never thought about that. That's a spicy take. I like that.
There is a big story
that
potentially to be told there. And I think this is a stream in and of itself. So let's just say, I'll drop that bomb. And once that one's been dropped,
God damn it! Now we have to do like a follow-up Crown of Nagash stream.
the Crown of Sorcery is freaking awesome.
It does. It's so important to so many different things.
And it comes back later in one of the coolest ways, much later.
Yes,
in the
okay.
But that's beside the point.
We don't have time for that.
So. No, because that's
damn it, cool. Andy.
Sigmar comes along with his big hammer, and as I recall in Graham McNeil's one, it's really nice because the hammer lights up with a bunch of runes that had never been noticed by anyone before, and then he bops Nagash and manages to kill a god with a weapon that no one believed could do that. So that in and of itself is super interesting. This is arguably the point when Gal Maraz moves from being the runic weapon that he was given into a runic weapon that's perhaps a lot more than everybody thought it was. Bong! Yeah, Nagash goes down.
Yeah, obviously huge moment for Sigmar. Complete upset. But yeah, he defeats Nagash, and I cannot, like Andy's kind of touched on, I cannot talk, like, it's so awesome in Graham McNeil's book, because it's literally, like, you know how in the Lord of the Rings, it's always like, oh, we have to destroy the ring or whatever. In Graham McNeil's take, it's literally like Aragorn puts on the One Ring and uses it to fight Sauron, and it's great. It's so good. But yeah, Nagash,
and if you know anything about the Crown of Sorcery, it also made him a wizard, but let's just not think about
which
that.
Is why Nagash could not just like point and kill him instantly, which I do think is a reasonable explanation.
And to cut a long story short, he yanks off the Crown of Sorcery, which makes Nagash reach out for it. He hits him in the face. Nagash dies. All the armies collapse, as is often the case with an undead army. It's a lovely way to narratively remove billions of undead.
Nagash does have time for one little thing as he's dying, which is he lets out another curse. Because as he's dying, instead of going, maybe I fucked up, he goes, fucking vampires.
Yep.
His last words are the goddamn vampires.
Fucking vampires. So they'll now not like Sigmar because Sigmar did this to me. As a small parallel, the whole source of this story is not actually anything to do with Nagash. We loosely touched upon this in maybe last week or the week before, can't recall. But in many respects, Nagash is the replacement of Drachenfels. Drachenfels, that was the big bad necromancer demonologist of the novels that were originally released in the 80s, but was a property that they weren't 100% sure that they owned. So they just created their own one, Nagash. But Drachenfels similarly was taken down by Sigmar in a gigantic battle involving both undead and demons. So Sigmar does this twice, not just once. He does it twice. Drachenfels comes down, is taken out, and from that day onwards, just mentioning the word Sigmar in Drachenfels' surrounding is enough to make him shake, to make him pause, and that's how he's taken out. Spoiler alert! In another book at a later point. So basically, exactly the same curse. The Drachenfels curse is just lifted up and dropped and put down on Nagash instead. So it wasn't strictly speaking an original idea that was but it was popped over. It was an idea that they already had and reused in a slightly different way. And when later on Drachenfels turns out to be something that they can use and have used in multiple books. That means that we have ourselves effectively a double event for Sigmar, where he not only faces off against the Neverchosen, he not only faces off against Nagash, he also faces off against Drachenfels, all within a 50-year period.
Sigmar,
the dude is busy.
Sigmar, while he's epic, there is a really hilarious through line of like, it's no wonder Sigmar abdicated the throne. He must have been fucking exhausted. It's like he fights that like the Bloodthirster in Middenheim and the whole incident with Garion / Azazel. He deals with like a terrifying Everchosen. He fights Nagash. He fights Drakenfell. Like he cannot get a fucking break. No wonder he leaves.
And to correct my earlier mistake, 1 year later, the very last remnant of Nagash's army is cornered up in the Grey Mountains, and Krell is felled beside the Glacial Lake, and the Mound of Krell is the last of Nagash's forces.
Yeah, which another point of how strong Nagash is in an interesting way is that, we all know the idea that if a Necromancer dies, the army collapses, which happened with Nagash's army, with two exceptions. Archon the Black obviously can keep himself going, and he just fled. Archon just got the fuck out of Dodge. Krell, though, is not a wizard. Krell cannot use sorcery. He is not a necromancer. He doesn't know necromancy. Mm-hmm. But Nagash did such a fucking good job, like rebinding his soul into him and making him into a champion that Krell doesn't die. Like Krell just he looks over, and this is in the Grim McNeil story. This is also after he gets shot in the chest with like an organ gun at point blank range, and he's been fighting like High King
the organ gun.
Yeah, he's been like fighting High King Kurgan Ironbeard. He's been fighting Alaric the Mad. He's still going, and he sees Nagash die, and he just goes, "Oh, all right," and he chops his way out of the battle, and he just starts running a campaign of terror through the Empire up into the Grey Mountains, trying to get away. And he's also looking for necromantic power to feed on. There's also, Graham McNeil did write a follow-up story that actually covers the final fight with Krell. It is amazing. But he ends up getting tracked down by Sigmar and the dwarfs. Sigmar beats him, and they seal him in a tomb in the Glacial Lake, where he remains until Kimmler ends up later. Yeah. Totally. So Nagash dies again. And what happens next, Andy?
So
he's gone forever, right?
He's gone forever. He's dead now. One of two things happens. So option number one, he comes back 1,666 years later. And this is rather famously dropped in a bunch of army lists. It's dropped in Warhammer 4th edition as well inside the timeline.
Major event.
A major event, the Night of Restless Dead or Living Dead, depending on which one you want to go for. And undead wake up pretty much all over the world. Not just in the Empire, not just where he fell, but all over the place. Dead, rise, dead, shift, and Nagash wakes up. Nagash, having done that whole drip, drip, drip thing, pops himself back up in the Black Pyramid and then retreats back to Nagashazar, where he sits in his throne and fucking broods unless somebody decides to use them in their army, and used as the model. That's one option. Another option is that he never comes back. He just vanishes. He's just gone, and he won't come back until the end times, when he returns, and characters like Drachenfels also fall underneath his sway, although called the Nameless One by this point, because they still weren't sure if they could use the name.
Oh, that explains why they did that. I was always like, it's a cool story thread, but why do they like I know who it is. They just say Drachenfels? They don't ever state who it is. That's actually super funny.
Yeah, it is funny. But yeah, as it turns out, Black Library did own the rights to that one.
I was gonna say Vermintide was very over the top with it. They're like,
totally. We used it for fantasy roleplay as well.
I'm glad they figured that out. That's really funny.
Yeah, it was very amusing. And End Times also suggests possibly that he was alive throughout that entire period, because the End Times doesn't completely marry with itself there. Yeah,
that's kind of a brief thing of like, there in the End Times, me and Andy were talking about before the stream, there's quite literally two separate accounts. One version from the elf perspective, they literally go to Nagashazar and literally see his body sitting on his throne, not doing anything, because he's just kind of consolidating power or whatever the hell he's up to. Yeah. And he starts to stir, and they're like, oh, we gotta go. But the first book, Nagash, like, there's the whole ritual to resurrect him, where
Volkmar.
it's very elaborate and it's really weird. And Volkmar becomes Nagash, and it's super odd. And he comes back, and the end times happen, but I'm not going to worry too much about the end times.
Yeah, let's not worry too much about that one. Let's instead, if you want to see a story of what it's like to be Nagash, go search yourself out the fourth edition of Warhammer, the very first Undead Army list. There's, I think, a 1 or 2 page story in there where Nagash is sitting on his throne. This is after his second or arguably third resurrection, depending on what you believe. He's brooding, lost in his mind. He no longer has anything that even comes close to resembling human emotion, and he spots a soul coming in to steal something. He is aware of every single soul in all of Nagashazar. He is, again, at the center of an empire in the heart of Nagashazar, which is both rotten, broken humans and a variety of undead. And he watches this one soul come in until eventually he murders it. But it's a fun wee story if you want to see one version of what Nagash is like. And as I said right at the very beginning of the stream, the first Undead Army list, the version of Nagash that's presented in there hasn't really changed that much from the one that they use right to the very end. So if you want to get an idea of the entire Nagash story as it was first presented, it's a pretty good read. There's a lot in there. It's the one that I read way back when it first came out, 1994. And it's the one that actually convinced me I wanted to get an Undead Army again. I'll admit, though, I was not a fan of the miniature.
Yeah, I definitely the end times definitely gave him a glow up.
Oh yeah. The art by Mark Gibbons inside that army list is absolutely marvelous. Big, huge swinging censer, huge sword, looks absolutely gorgeous. Mark is the best, but what that turned into with its funny looking clown model, which I painted 3 times because I still had him in my armies.
Nice.
It just wasn't good. I tried so hard to make that model not look rubbish, and it was hard. It was really hard.
Okay, so yeah, so that's large in point the Nagash story. Really, genuinely a very interesting character. There's a lot, I think, for anyone that kind of reads through his stuff. There's a lot of fun to explore about his, like, he's a character that has a lot of interesting things with arrogance, paranoia, megalomania, fear of death. Like, he's a very interesting character in a lot of ways. But we have a ton of comments on the Discord and stuff we have to get through. Also, some super chats that came through of Nagash just bragging he tortured the Dark Elves.
I think just loosely that there is a story here that the novels did not cover in a way that I think was particularly well covered, where there is a real sense that possibly it was intended. I mean, you can't take 3 sorcerers the way they took them.
Yeah, though I will say I do love the version of the story of how he kills them, where he like imprisons their heads in a lead helmet so they can't feel the winds of magic anymore, and he like puts out their eyes and takes out their tongues and stuff, and then he entombs them alive in a sarcophagus. It's like, damn, Nagash, that's brutal.
I mean, I love that shit, and I also like the idea that elven hubris has resulted in Nagash, and that they were attempting to do something, and Nagash ended up being far more than they had any awareness of that.
He's just a monkey. What's he gonna do?
Yeah, quite exactly. Yeah.
Hammond, I hate this. Thank you.
Oh man.
And also he'll be Buck. Yes, good old Lizardman Buck. So going through the Discord comments, we're just gonna kind of blast through these because a lot of people have questions. So Jar Jar Skinks asks, Jar Jar Skinks, thank you for that. Did Nagash have any opinions of the Vampire Coast or vice versa? I'm sure he would have saw them as a useful tool that he would abuse like he does everything.
Yeah, one of the great, let's call it a flaw, because I think it's a flaw. One of the great flaws of the end times was its complete focus on these tiny areas that the army list dealt with without any real awareness of the rest of the Warhammer world, meaning that things that should have had an enormous impact, like Grand Cathay, are ignored. And things like the Vampire Coast and all the fun things that are down there don't get a mention, and the correlation and ties that they would have had with creatures like Nagash are largely ignored. They say, oh, Nagash brought back a bunch of people and made them as Mortarks, and we'll go for all the characters we can find. and they quickly jump on those. So loosely, yeah, all of those things would have probably fallen under his sway, but we don't really get much said about it.
Yeah, and they're I thought you'd appreciate that.
I did.
Yeah, and they're vampires at the end of the day, and they're undead. So if Nagash did come back, it's something they would have to definitely worry about. Like vampires can resist Nagash's control, but if he gets close enough to them or he has enough power, he becomes a problem. And there's a lot he could offer Luther Harkin. And the Vampire Coast pirates tend to be a little more on the greedy side compared to other vampires. So I think if anything, he might have an easier time bargaining with them compared to others. That being said, I would have loved to have seen Nagash discover the Galleon's graveyard. The idea that the other side of the Great Maw is just a giant undead playground where everything that dies at sea is gathered to. Nagash would have gone for that shit real fast.
Yeah, and given that he's on multiple occasions had undead fleets under his control and his command, the idea that he wouldn't be drawing on that stuff come the end times or any other times is frankly daft.
Yeah, and he does summon Luther Harkin to him. Luther Harkin becomes the Mortarch of the Deeps in the end times, which was fun. If Nagash was a canary, how much warpstone would it take to kill him? I don't know if he capitalized canary, so I feel like that references something specific. But Nagash,
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, neither do I. But I will say Nagash has proven that I genuinely think he can devour a pretty much unlimited amount of warpstone because he designed himself to do it.
His armor, the study of centuries. He knows what to do and not how to do it safely, but how to do it in a fashion that will not long-term damage him.
Yeah. What does Nagash think of the invented undead from what he originally came up with? I think I assume you mean like kind of modern undead. He'd probably think of the same thing he did with vampires. He'd look at that and go, oh, neat, this is mine now.
Yep, it's a tool. Effectively anything with the undead trait is for him to play with.
Yeah. What was Nagash's relationship with the other races of the Warhammer world, like Dark Elves, Lizardmen, Grand Cathay, etc.? Probably not great.
Yeah, if you take a look at, say, the Lands of the Dead, they had contact with Grand Cathay, and
Nehekara was an ally of theirs.
Yeah, totally.
Trade partner, at least.
He's going to be aware of it. It's not something that's distant to him, but they are not going to be pals when he becomes Nagash, the great enchanter that comes later, the great necromancer, pardon me, supreme master from death.
Yeah, at the end of the day, he literally takes the entire Warhammer world and flips it on its head.
Yeah, he does.
And anyone that deals with him for more than a second realizes that unless you are a corpse serving him, you are an obstacle. So he would not be friendly with anyone because he's...
Yeah, I mean, if you take a look at the deal that he made with the Skaven, for example, that was one of expediency. It shows that he has an intellect, that he can be dealt with, and that he's not somebody that is beyond approach, so to speak. He is something that actually does have a thinking mind, and he's brooding when he comes up 1,666 years later, and he's sitting there brooding for a good few centuries, figuring out how he wants to do things differently. And that shows that he has reflection. That shows that he is someone who can be dealt with. So that means that certain creatures Dark Elves, for example, might approach him if there was a reason to do so. But why would they?
Yeah.
Why?
There are certainly characters who would try. I would absolutely say that. And
the chances of success are super low, though.
Yeah. You'd have to have something pretty serious to offer him, and even then, probably not worth it. Does Nagash consider himself a god? I think he does, but he would take offense at the term.
I'm going to go slightly further and say he doesn't. I would say that he wishes to be a god, that he has contempt for the other gods, and that ascension is a core part of his character in the same way that ascension was a core part of what would become Nagash. There is an entire plot line that loosely alights upon this with the 1,000 Thrones for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition. The entire campaign for that is the 1,000 Thrones of vampires coming to take over the world, which is ultimately run by Nagash behind the scenes. And that is a step towards ascension, becoming an actual god. So I don't think that He thinks of himself currently as a god, although in terms of his actual true power, he is as close to a material god as you can possibly get in the Warhammer world.
Yeah, and if the version of Nagash we run with now in Age of Sigmar, where he is a god, and a lot of his end times characterization, when he rips out the Wind of Death, that is when you see full on God Nagash.
Yep, absolutely. And that is also where you see the full-on culmination of his overall plan. For all I will happily diss the end times, and I quite enjoy doing so. That doesn't mean that all of the steps that it took were wrong. That doesn't mean that some of the choices that it made for its characters weren't good choices. And Nagash and his drive towards becoming a god, 100% on point. I think that is directly exactly what he's attempting to do. I wouldn't necessarily say that for pretty much any of the other characters that became gods, but definitely for Nagash.
Yeah. CB4N, thank you for the super chat again. Thanks again for the stream as usual. Am I remembering the timeline right that Nagash's early years and the War of the Beard are around the same time? Nagash's Nehekara in general is after the War of the Beard by a pretty decent little bit. Because Nehekarans kind of expanded into the vacuum left behind by the dwarves and the elves. And plus, you have to remember, Nagash encountered dark elves, and that kind of says a lot.
I think you might be off.
Oh, you know what? I think I am. Now I think about it.
So let's see. The War of the Beard started. Let me just get it up because pretty sure it's 2000. 2000? It is. It's 2000. Okay, so the War of the Beard started 4,500 years ago. Nagash was born 4,500 years ago. So they are pretty much directly on top of each other. The War of the Beard, though, largely takes place in the old world. That's where almost all of it goes. So down there, they're pretty much on the edge of it. And the crashing Dark Elves are almost certainly because of something that occurred with the War of the Beard.
There you go.
Probably why the Dark Elves are over
I'm
there.
so bad with timeline shit.
I thought I'd check it up just to make sure I was right.
No. So yes, you are correct. Those events, and honestly, I would say that could be why you would think the Nehekarans would probably have a lot of trade and involvement and maybe even alliances with the dwarves. Could be why the dwarves didn't get involved. They were busy.
I do find
because you figure Karak Azul would have been like, "What is going on over there?"
Because see. The timeline for humanity is a little bit muddled in that there's this strong sense, particularly with the dwarves and the elves, that they are the elder species and that humans most certainly are not. But 4,500 years ago, which is a long time ago, Nehekara is at its peak. Not only that, Grand Cathay is it's at its peak almost from the beginning. So there is definitely something wrong in terms of the general characterization of humanity by some of the other species. And I'm interested to see whether that modifies with the old world and whether they include others within.
Real quick, you said the War of the Beard was 4,000 years ago?
It's 4,500, according to this one.
Yeah, so this is probably because of changes, but in 8th edition, it says that Nehekara doesn't even really, or Cetra is in minus 2,500. Nagash is not until minus 2,000.
Minus 2,000? Yeah, that would be the same time as the start of the War of the Beard.
Oh, you're counting from modern year.
Yeah. So that's
I thought you meant minus 4,000 imperial calendar.
No. Minus 2,000 imperial calendar. Sorry.
Okay, now we're on the same page.
4,500 years ago in total.
Okay, sorry. I like my IC dates.
Pardon me, that was my fault entirely.
No, you're all good. You're all good. How many times has Nagash been defeated or slain or suffered enormous downfall? Okay, those are very different categories. He's died
officially twice. But unofficially at least 3, if not 4 times.
Oh yeah, if you count the wandering in the desert.
Wandering the desert 3. He died more than once there as well. As he skipped in and out of mortality, and he moved from being just a standard mortal into something that's a bit different.
Yeah. See, big, but like downfalls, quite a few.
To be honest, he's been beaten quite a lot. In that, he's got classic Worf syndrome from Star Trek. And by that, I mean, he gets pulled out whenever you want to show that somebody else is kick-ass. So how are we going to make Sigmar look kick-ass? I know, we'll have him beat Nagash, the most powerful thing that we have. Oh, that means Sigmar is suddenly super awesome. And that's what happens with Worf all the time. Oh, look at this incredibly powerful thing. Oh, we'll have it beat up Worf. Oh, it's surely powerful. Gets beat up every third episode.
Could Nagash kill Archaon? It would depend a lot on which version of Nagash. And also
version of Archaon.
Yeah, and also which version of Archaon. Like Archaon consistently got juiced up more and more and more the later we go in war. Because for the end times, they had to make him the end times Archaon makes like Storm of Chaos Archaon look like an absolute bitch.
Absolutely.
So
if we ignore the end times and we just cut it off just before there, and we look at the characters, then Archaon would have his ass handed to him most of the time.
Yeah. From a narrative perspective, Archaon tends to win because he has like not plot armor, but like plot sword. To beat, he's supposed to blow up the world, so obviously he has to be unstoppable. But the feats that he accomplishes don't really support him being able to beat Nagash.
It's a little bit like if you look at the old Storm of Chaos plotline. The whole point of that was for Chaos to win, but it didn't.
Yeah, I will say there's a very notable difference between Archaon, the Storm of Chaos, who is a level 1 wizard, and Archaon, the End Times, who is a level 4+ wizard. Yeah. Because they realized that he needed to be very big.
Absolutely. And I'd also add as well that if you just skip beyond looking at stats and what they did, Nagash is effectively a god. And the one that's in the modern times is arguably less powerful than the one before he just did his big, great ritual. That was arguably Nagash at his peak. But even the one with his claw and his crown, sitting there with his armor on, with his big sword, that character is absolutely bonkers. There's a reason they didn't add him back to Warhammer until the very end. It's because he was considered to be too powerful to actually deploy. Plus, he didn't really fit into the Vampire and Tomb King split when they split them up.
Is there anyone that could permanently destroy Nagash for good? I think plenty of people could under the right circumstances. Yeah. It's certainly doable. No one in Warhammer is genuinely invulnerable.
Yep, completely agree. And I'd go further and say that's the case for almost every. Yeah. In fact, as you say, every character. Can be
even this would be a fun topic one day, but like I would even debatably argue any god can be killed under the right circumstances. It's just really hard.
Yeah, it's a fun old one. The big thing with these characters is that when you take them out of context, it's much easier to say, well, that character, we could get killed by that one. But the second you put them in context and you go, well, he's in Nagashazar, surrounded by an empire, that makes it suddenly much less difficult. He's an entire faction that everybody forgets about because he's in that dark area that no one goes to typically in Games Workshop lore. But there is a big empire of Nagash down there just waiting to pop up and would make, I think, a fascinating faction for example, with the old world. Don't think they'll do it, but they might.
Yeah, it would be fun. It's as much as people in the community really love those who would win scenarios. Like we've had a lot of requests to do those here on the show, and we might kind of entertain those from time to time. But like they're kind of dumb because you have to the parameters is most of the discussion of like, well, how the fuck would this work? Because like Nagash versus Archaon. Well, is it Archaon? The thing that makes the Everchosen is that he binds together all of the legions of chaos. It's not necessarily that Archaon himself is unstoppable. It's that he's leading an unstoppable legion of like him versus Nagash. They probably wouldn't even fight each other until like very late and it would be kind of dramatic. But like, Archaon would be sitting there on a hill on Dorger being like, and there'd be greater demons attacking Nagash, and that would be kind of the fight. Context is if we're going down this rabbit, see, this is what I'm talking about.
Indeed, in Aryan versus Nagash, that's a fun one though.
Yeah, honestly,
I mean that's a god slaying weapon.
Yeah, I mean my money would be on an Aryan. I'm gonna be honest.
I think mine probably would be too.
But once again, context is Nagash at the back of his huge legion. I honestly think Nagash could wear down an Aryan and beat him. But if it's just the two of them in a room, an Aryan's going to kick the shit out of him. But Nagash would not allow that. So, Anyway, next
Sigmar
question.
killed him after all.
Yeah, and it's like debatably Sigmar kind of had to trick him for that, and once again, yeah, and I think
Hubris.
Yeah, I think Nagash was like, "Oh, a human, I could do this." I think Nagash probably would have been a lot more wary about an Aryan on his dragon. He probably would have been like, "No, I'm not going to fight that."
We should have. Then we have Nagash and a zombie dragon. That's a fight.
Yeah, but it's like it's kind of like Cetra versus Nagash. Nagash realized he could not beat Cetra and was like, "I'm just not going to do this. I'm going to run away,
retreat, go sit in my home."
Was there ever an ounce of goodness in Nagash, or was he always rotten to the core?
Well, this is a really difficult question to answer because there's not really any such thing as objective goodness.
He's also not that well explored before he kind of becomes full megalomaniacal Nagash.
Yeah, and his character significantly changes when he arrives at the Sour Sea and he starts experimenting with Warpstone. And Warpstone, by its very nature, corrupts. But beyond the simple fact that he corrupts and becomes different, before that, he was already quite, let's say, unique.
I would say if you ever wanted to try and frame, could Nagash have had a good side to him? I do think there could be some interesting exploration into what Nagash may have witnessed as a child and a teenager that he became so convinced that the gods were just awful.
Yeah, I think
people shouldn't be under them.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think that was actually my biggest issue when I was moving into the Nagash novels, and that's that they didn't really explore Nagash. They didn't really justify his character, because his character and the way it comes across has no real pillar behind it to explain why he is the way he is. What were his loves? What were his hates? Who is he? Who is he other than Nagash?
Yeah, the books. Okay, so I'm going to take a very brief moment to say that I personally do not think the Nagash Black Library novels are worth reading. I think they're not a great implementation of the character. They kind of assume you know who Nagash is and don't explore it at all. And I don't like them, but that's nothing against.
I hate them.
Yeah, I'm not trying. I don't want to shit on the author. I just don't like the story he told, and it conflicts very heavily with literally everything else.
It does.
Does Nagash have a notable grudge against the Skaven for the Fellblade? Oh yeah.
Yeah,
big time.
Yeah, big time. And the Skaven in turn have a significant grudge against him, and it's not just because he's defeated them significantly on multiple occasions. Just bluntly, yes. I mean, I think what we said already covers everything.
Could Nagash claim the Cathayan spirits that the Dragon of Death watches over under the Dragon River? I think he absolutely could, but he would have to obviously fight.
There's a fight there.
Yeah, it would be a throwdown. We know that there's the Court of Shaiish, which is like a whole ancestral monk order that defends it. If there's an order to defend it, that means it can be threatened. So yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that perfectly describes it.
Yeah. What if Nagash was not the firstborn? Well, then he wouldn't be Nagash.
Yep. He'd be the secondborn. He'd be king.
Yeah. Yeah, he would have just been King Nagash instead of King Thutep. And he probably would have been kind of an asshole king, but he probably would have been a lot like Cetra.
Yeah, I think he and Cetra would have been very similar.
What if Nagash was born an elf? Then he just wouldn't be Nagash.
No, he wouldn't. No,
so
it'd be
I guess
so
if you're
massively different.
Yeah, I guess if you're asking, like, what if it had been an elf that had explored the type of necromancy that he did, that could be an interesting mental exercise, but it'd be weird.
It would be weird. Now, the reason I would suggest that it would probably never happen is because the elves are intrinsically linked to their gods. They are intrinsically linked to the way that their gods work, what their gods believe. Pretty much every single major elf faction or how they work is tied directly to one of their gods and how those gods think. Gods don't like necromancy. It is wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't like souls and spirits doing stuff. What they don't like is material corpses popping up for no reason at all. That goes against the order of nature. So elves, because they generally work within the order of nature, and I include the Druki with that, they are 100% working within the realms of the gods. They're just working within different gods to others.
Yeah.
But the undead do not. So I do not see them ever becoming true necromancers. Yeah,
one of the things that's super interesting about necromancy is so perverse in the Warhammer world. Even despite all of their insanity and how opposed they are and everything, the 4 dark brothers, the dark gods, they hate necromancy. They hate it, which is insane. Like, that's how perverse it is. We're like, especially vampires. There's actually a lot of really fun stuff about how the dark brothers do not like vampires for their own reasons.
You got to remember that the chaos gods are immaterial creatures, and the undead are pretty much 100% material.
Yeah, they're pure material.
Yeah, they're antithetical to each other. Now, if you go all the way back to the original imaginations of Tzeentch, the original Tzeentch had quite a lot of undead iconography working through it. Some of the old Chaos champions of Tzeentch had like skull faces and bones, and there was that touch of undead running through it. They eradicated that when they explored the undead as an actual concept, rather than just we're throwing all the cool shit in. Now, you can obviously use that if you are sitting out there wondering about your own role-play games, for example. I'm thinking, can I try and draw that into my Tzeentch version of iconography? Of course you can. But if you're looking at what Games Workshop do, they are thoroughly and completely antithetical.
Yeah. Is Nagash the first Lich, or is it Drakenfels? Drakenfels is kind of a weird... Drakenfels is, like Andy said, Games Workshop did not touch him for a really long time, so he never got to be ported into how the world evolved. He's been kind of stagnant, and he's really weird because of that.
Yeah,
like he's I don't even know how to really describe him because he's so unique compared to everybody else.
Drakenfels is unique, and I don't think that he benefits for being categorized. It's much better to say Drakenfels is Drakenfels, and we can just sit there. Does he have the undead trait? Well, given what the End Times did with him, the answer would be yes. But I would argue that and say that the End Times didn't necessarily make best use of the character. Is then Nagash the first? No, because there was already liches.
Liches were all over the place.
That they were all over what eventually becomes the Land of the Dead in Nehekara. They were an established thing, and Nagash came into, and it probably would have become a Lich Priest along with the rest of them. That was his fate, but he took it much further.
What is in Nagash's books? A lot. So the 9 books of Nagash contain pretty much everything Nagash ever discovered about magic and necromancy. That is the easiest way I can put it.
Yeah. And it's fair to say that everything that is understood as necromancy later is already in there. He effectively didn't just write the book in it, he also found the limits. Yeah, and that's super important because it makes those books exceedingly important, because they do not just contain how it works, they contain how all of it works.
Yeah, there's every single necromantic tome that exists outside of the 9 books of Nagash are usually someone's attempt to translate one of Nagash's books, or they're translating a translation of one of Nagash's books, or translating
the Crown of Sorcery. Yeah, someone wielding the Crown of Sorcery starts penning parts of the books of Nagash. That happens on more than one occasion. And yeah, it's the source of all things that is perverted and wrong about magic.
Yeah, but having just one book is like Vlad von Karstein almost destroying the Empire when he performs the big ritual that raises all the dead in Sylvania. He did that with one book.
Yep, one.
Just one. Having more than one is virtually unheard of for a character. Most characters that have access to a book have a single one. I cannot think of a single character that has 2 books. That like is usually maybe Zacharias the Everliving, maybe. Because anyway. But yeah. Did Marathi know that Nagash's necromancy was derived from the form of Dar she created? And if so, what did she think of it and Nagash himself?
Now, you see, that's one of those questions that's firstly impossible to answer, because you're not sure that it definitely came. You don't even know if it's definitely her brand of dark magic that was used. But I will say that would she be able to, if she faced it, detect that it's very similar to many of the things that she had done? Yes.
Luring Lion, yeah, we could take a look at that in the last little couple minutes. Apparently a little thing dropped and people are throwing money at us to look at it. So yes,
how exciting.
Yeah, we'll do that in the last few minutes. John Locke Cole, what are Nagash's favorite and least favorite office supply stores? Thank you for that question. I don't know.
I feel like there should be a pun in here somewhere, but I can't think of one.
Yeah, I know. I can't think of anything deadly enough or like bony enough. I don't know what the word. Moving on. Yeti 13. Why have the Skaven not recreated the fell blade and used it on other things? Because they would never agree to create a weapon like that again, because one of them might use it against them.
And they all were required to make it. It wasn't something that was easily made by a single individual. It took them all working together to actually create this extraordinary weapon, which was, as we all know from the Skaven, pretty much only ever going to be a one-off because they never agree.
Rick Lally, thank you.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
that. Plan carry.
God damn it.
Of course it is. we were trying to make it clever that we shouldn't
we shouldn't have
tried. Okay, I'm only going to answer this because Epsilon 17. I need to like curate y'all's questions. Y'all are abusing this privilege. Does Nagash fuck? Yes, Vashnash is one of his descendants. There you go. Moving on.
Yeah. Yes is the answer to that. Plus the novel. Plus the novel sort of goes into some of those sessions there. Very. It's a bit.
There is. I'm ignoring the novels because I don't like them. There is actually some really interesting things that Nagash is kind of portrayed in a lot of different things. Nagash is often portrayed as borderline asexual. He does not care a lot of the times about carnal desires. He just doesn't have them, seemingly. If he had descendants, which he does, he likely did that for like political reasons or like a dynasty reason, but he does not seem to actually genuinely lust for anyone.
Cut it bluntly, he was a king for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And that comes with all the trappings of being a leader. And do you think he's just going to sit up there and not consider the potential of dynasty? The very nature of what he was attempting to create, legitimacy. So I think there is no doubt at all that that would have been a part of his power play.
Yep. Let's see. Oh my gosh. From my reading, it says that when Nagash fought the Priest Kings, it was the first time the dead had been raised to serve another. However, Nagash was taught the secret of Dar for the Dark Elves. Did they teach him dark magic generally and discover necromancy? Did they already know necromancy? And if so, why don't the... Okay, so this boils down to, why don't elves use undead slaves?
And I think that we've already covered that to quite some depth, and it's because it's fucking wrong.
Yeah, so there you go. Which a lot of people think dark elves are just like sinister evil. They always do the wrong thing, but they're not. There's more
really not.
They have a system of morals. It's just not a human system of morals.
Absolutely. Thinking that the Druki are bad guys is doing a disservice to them. They're not good people. But thinking that they only do evil things for evil's sake is incorrect. They do not.
Isn't Nagash's endgame kind of boring? Kill everyone and sit around and be bored? Not if you literally want to be God and control an ordered universe.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think you understand how arrogant he is. And also how much he fears like change and things that can threaten him.
Yeah, Tzeentch is pretty much his natural enemy. I would argue the only way that he would be happy with Tzeentch is if he was Tzeentch.
Yep. How canonical is it that Nagash sounds like Skeletor? Don't you know what? Enjoy your dreams. That's if you want that to be the case, there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah, you just I have zero doubt there is someone at Games Workshop that has worked on Nagash who felt that was the case. Did Nagash ever realize there are planets beyond the Warhammer world to conquer? I don't think he has in the Warhammer Fantasy timeline, but I'm sure if he had succeeded, he would have eventually.
Right. So there are other planets inside the Warhammer solar system. Some of those are probably inhabited in some fashion or another. Would he have been aware of those? Absolutely, because if there's anything you can say about any civilization that's based on Egyptians, that's that they are aware of celestial objects. So I think there is no doubt that he would have been aware of them to a degree, but I don't think that that was really part of any of his major thinking.
Yeah, no. If he had succeeded and like dominated the entire planet, he might have started looking outward. What is the core reason why Nagash managed to become so much more than Cetra ever did? They figured out immortality.
Yeah.
And also he could actually use magic.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of the two big ones.
Yeah, magic is the big superpower of the Warhammer world. And Nagash has access to a superpower. Cetra has access to his own bloody-minded determination.
Yeah. And yeah, I think if Cetra had been the one who found the Dark Elves and they had taught him magic instead, I think he would have just been Nagash before Nagash.
Assuming that he even had the capability to cast spells, given that it's something that is not necessarily inherent to all humans.
Yep. How did Nagash get away with a lot of what he did while in the mortuary cult? Was Kotep not around?
Oh, no, he was.
Well, Nagash A was very secretive about a lot of it. He was very stealthy. Also, he'd been in the mortuary cult for a long time. He knew what he was doing, and he knew them better than they knew him.
Yeah, and when he made his move, he was nigh on unassailable.
Yeah. So they had to run. They fled.
Or support him. Because you're going to die if you don't.
Did Nagash fear Cetra? I would say absolutely.
Nagash doesn't fear. I would say that Nagash realized that there were steps that he couldn't take, so withdrew. I don't think fear is quite the right word for Nagash.
That's fair.
In the same way that Nagash, I don't really think has anything that's really strong beyond some rather negative need for revenge and such like that he broods upon. But fear, I think, is probably too strong. The only thing that he's really left with fearing, if you go by the canonical version of him, is Sigmar's bloody hammer.
Yeah, I think he would be very frustrated by Cetra. In that, it's literally something he just can't touch.
Annoyed.
Yeah. But yeah. And you have to remember that by the time Nagash meets Cetra, he's not human at all. He's undead, and I would say the way Nagash processes what little emotions he feels, like Nagash genuinely probably believes he doesn't feel emotion because he probably thinks he's above that. And and what he does feel is probably very little.
Yeah, I'll hark back to that original Undead Army List story again. It goes into a little bit of his character there, and obviously it's changed over time, but it gives you a good place to show how he has moved beyond the vast majority of human emotion.
Nagash has some pretty wacky feats, the biggest one being that he literally devours Usirian. That's end time stuff. Don't worry about it. End times was end times. That's literally all I can say to it.
I am become death.
Yeah, in the end times, he has one of his Mortarchs chant a big ritual for the 9 books of Nagash, and while that's chanting, it powers him up enough where he kills Usirian and eats him. And God eating is a very notable trait that Nagash gets in the end times that he has carried into Age of Sigmar. He eats a lot of gods, but that is not something that's a very. Don't worry about it.
I think it's a natural progression of his character while simultaneously not really enjoying how it was handled.
Yeah. In Age of Sigmar, I think it's handled a lot better than it was in the end times. And I think his devouring of Valea was handled well. The devouring of Assyrian was weird. Tomb Kings has some very powerful constructs that seem far more useful than your usual undead. Did Nagash make use of them after raising Khemri? They require God's help, so I don't think he could.
Nope, that's not his shtick.
Yeah. Plus, he would probably view that as beneath him. Like he wants to use his own toys.
You got to remember that they were the toys that were used against him, and the mortuary priests did not want to do that. The mortuary cult had no plans of showing their true power until Nagash became so powerful they had to move against him, and then they brought everything they had to bear to bring him down. And by that point, he's using necromancy in a very different style of magic.
Lally, does Manfred actually think Nagash was weak? Absolutely.
Yeah, Manfred. Yeah,
100%. Manfred would absolutely, like, the end times plot of Manfred helping resurrect Nagash because he thinks he can, like, take on Nagash, I think is 100% accurate. And boy, he fucked up.
Yeah, Manfred has got a towering personality disorder.
Andy, would you say you're educated on D&D lore?
I have some of it, but not much of it.
This is a very specific question.
And I'm probably screwed.
Nagash versus Vecna from
D&D. Christ.
And I'm like, I don't know nearly enough about that, dude.
I'm going to say Nagash because we're in a Nagash stream.
There we go. What was Nagash's greatest, most epic fight? Sigmar.
Yeah.
Because that was Nagash getting to like kind of pre-plan and throw everything he had, and he still loses. Instead of it being like he gets caught by surprise, which is usually how he loses.
Yeah, I quite like the Alcatazar fight. But I like that because it's desperate. Where the Nagash fight, I always feel it's a little bit like we're just trying to make Sigmar awesome.
That's fair.
And I have that slight, when I read it, I'm still like, yeah, you're just making Sigmar awesome. That's all you're doing, really, isn't it? Where with the Alcatrazar Nagash fight, it feels proper desperate. With the Council of 13 doing everything they can, and it's super epic in terms of its overall impact, because if the Skaven lose, arguably he's going to do it again. And this is the point where he attempts to take over the world. The world is saved by the Council of 13.
Yeah, which is hilarious. Also, awesome. Literally the best thing Age of Sigmar ever did was bring back the Skaven stopping Nagash's ultimate ritual. That scene, I'll have to send to you sometime, Andy, because it's
I've read it.
Funny. Oh yeah, I love Nagash is doing the mental checklist of every god he's beaten. He's like, yeah, I'm safe, and then he goes, wait, where are the Skaven? It's so great. Does Nagash ever feel remorse? No.
Nah. Regret, yes, because he broods. Remorse, no.
Yeah. So I will say though, for the most epic fight, we never got it like written. I would have loved to see an author do the first big fight between Nagash and Cetra when Nagash did not realize he could not beat Cetra, and Cetra was going all out because he was pissed. That was probably an epic throwdown.
I imagine it's probably a little bit less epic than, say, Sigmar, though, which was pretty much world-endingly awesome. The sky crashes with thunder.
True.
I reckon that's going to be much...
Nagash panic.
I think it'll just be kind of cool to see Nagash panic and realize that everything that he's throwing isn't working, and then he just gets the hell out of dodge and runs, because it's the best option that he has available. The best way to deal with Cetra is just to throw a bunch of troops in front of him.
My understanding is Nagash sometimes betrays his own followers. Is there anyone that knows that and still serves Nagash of their own free will?
Betrays his own followers? Wait a minute.
I guess like in the sense of like vampires and stuff.
No, they betrayed him first.
Yeah.
I mean, he puts checks and balances in to ensure that should anyone betray him, he can fuck them over royally. And he does take control of anything that has the undead trait because he thinks that's just his. But when it comes to fucking over his followers, not really. It tends to be more of a punishing failure type of idea.
Yeah, and I would say that the only truly loyal agents to Nagash are Archon and Krell.
Yeah.
Generally speaking. But
I'd go further. I'd say that there's probably thousands of truly loyal worshippers of Nagash. Like loads of them all over the place.
Yeah. Something I would love, I know they're never going to do it, but if I wish you had done this, if Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th ever got like a dungeon supplement for Nagash's art, it'd be fucking awesome.
Fucking awesome. Yeah,
because like it's full. Like there are people there. There's
a whole fucking empire. That would be
it's still there.
Enormous amount of fun to write. I had a plan for bringing back Nagash around about 4th campaign if we ever got there, and using that. It was going to start off with the Crown of Sorcery coming in with a certain wyvern riding orc, and that would be quite fun.
Can Nagash be permanently killed? Absolutely, anybody can.
Definitely, yeah.
It'd be hard, but like the end times, they actually did a good job of introducing a MacGuffin to kill him, which was actually one of the magic. I think it's the Blade of
the Eternity. No, the
Eternity Sword,
Eternity
or like
sword.
Blade of Eternities, whatever it was.
Whatever it's called, yeah, that thing.
Yeah, it's a sword that existed in the canon before, and it very logically would kill Nagash if he gets stabbed with it. Unfortunately, they don't stab him with it, or he does get stabbed with it, but it's after he like becomes full god mode, so it doesn't work. Which like, all right. All right, the last what is the Black Pyramid made out of?
It's black marble. It's mentioned in multiple places that it's black marble. I imagine it's as it's mentioned in multiple places as well. It's covered in runes. They've done various magical treatments to it, but ultimately it is a black marble that is pulled from presumably the World's Edge Mountains or somewhere equally distant.
Okay, and then we're out of time, but I promised we would look at this very, very short little clip. So let me pull that up real quick, and I'll send it to you. And then we.
While you're doing that, does Nagash have cults? Yes, there's multiple cults to Nagash. I'm just noticing that from Lord Zemus.
But yeah, hey, if you see any last second questions you want to answer, by all means.
Yeah, I'm still an idiot and I haven't got my ID set up so I can bring them up myself. But yeah, they do. Was Andy talked about LAWhammer in the past tense? No, absolutely freaking not. And my LAWhammer is moving on every single freaking week.
Yeah, no, he's progressing way faster than like any other campaign I've ever seen. It's awesome.
We're just sadly not dealing with undead just now, so not a lot of correlation with this particular episode.
Okay. Oh, okay. So this is a very short little. This is like so short. I don't even know if it's really that much worth looking at. So this is here, I'll post it in our Discord chat. But so they're dropping hints for the upcoming characters for Shadows of Change, and this one looks like a certain potentially Baba Yaga-ish type character who
I wonder who that's going to be then.
Yeah, who totally didn't leak on Reddit earlier this week. But yeah, I'm very excited. I'm very curious what Mother Ostenkio will look like. I am super duper 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 excited.
I don't think I could be more excited about something that I effectively created being reintroduced in a different way into the game. That's just brilliant.
The hags have been my most requested thing for the races that we have in Total War.
I love hags.
There are 3 clips. What do you mean there are 3 clips?
Oh, god damn it.
Oh,
yep, there's one.
Well, okay. Yeah, so there's Yuan Bo, who we've already seen confirmed and stuff, and there's the Changeling, who we've already seen confirmed and stuff. In the story that I bet Andy has totally read by now. We'll make him. We're gonna make him take a quiz at the start of next Sunday's stream.
Me, I still haven't read it. Oh, that is so embarrassing. I keep on right. Let's write it into my bloody to-do list.
Could have read that instead of the Nagash book. That would have been a better use of time.
You're almost certainly correct, but I did read it nevertheless. You know, it's always good to do your prep and then realize that you wish you hadn't.
Are we sure it's the Changeling based on the short story they released? Yeah. Do any of the clips have the chicken hut? No, it's literally just like a tree and like a super spooky tree. Yeah, unfortunately, I based on a lot of things, it is not Egram as much as I want it to be Egram. We would love to do a Egram von Horseman chat, but we can't yet for reasons. Not Total War related reasons, I should say. For LAWhammer reasons. We don't want to spoil things about him. But in any event,
definitely for our one.
Unfortunately, we're out of time.
That's just the way time goes. It flies by.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for watching. Once real Shadow of Change stuff, not just the little teasers, but once like actual stuff is out, we'll do a thing about it and chat about it because it'll be really fun. And there's a lot of old lore that's being brought up from what stuff Andy's written for Kislev. Then we've got like full on new stuff with Cathay, where I've sent Andy a lot of reading material. Poor Andy. I'm just
no poor Andy. On him. I devour this stuff. It's what I love.
Yeah, and then of course the Zinch stuff. Once we have the confirmation of the characters. So we will, once that's all been like fully revealed, we will absolutely do a Lorebeards on what everything is and like what we think about it from a lore perspective, because that's what's fun and that's what we do here. But anyway, that is it for this stream. We hope you enjoyed all the stuff, learning about Nagash. It was a lot of fun to chat about. I love Nagash. Nagash.
I'd like to conclude with a heavy, I actually loved Nagash as a character. I think that they did an extraordinary job, and I think the initial version put together by Bill King and Jervis Johnson all the way back in 1994, the fact that it has remained so consistent throughout the time shows just how strong their character building was back then. I just love him. He's the best.
Yes, and just randomly a few last little things. Chaos Rising, yes, I'm gonna do a video about Chaos Rising later today. Andy was at the premiere for it.
I was.
Yeah, so he got to see it all cool and stuff. I watched it yesterday. I watched it yesterday with my family. It was a ton of fun. It was exactly what I hoped it would be, and there were actually a couple surprises in there that I really enjoyed. Yes, and also disemvoweling people is very fun.
Always.
But also make sure, if you haven't already, please go check out LAWhammer. And here's the thing. you have to go subscribe to LAWhammer because the community poll for the next Lorebeards is going to be on the LAWhammer channel, not mine.
Yeah.
So
Come and get it.
So if you want to be able to help decide what the next subject is going to be for next week, you got to go to Andy's channel. It's not going to be on my channel. I will direct you to it, but you have to go sub over there. We need to get him above like 10K quick.
That'd be lovely. Do come along, you 10Ks. So you know what you're getting. You'll get a mixture of occasional lore stuff, but I play Warhammer every single week, well, for the LAWhammer game, where we play the most famous campaign ever written for Warhammer, The Enemy Within, for the fantasy roleplay game. And we do that every single Friday, but we already have like 25 videos up there that you can work your way through, redolent with lore. I also do mapping as well, so that's mapping of different parts of the Warhammer world. At the moment, I'm mapping the town of Callaghan, which is in the Reichland, and those streams are a mixture of me just chatting away about what we're mapping, but also deep lore dives into the sort of things that you can get there. So do please, Queek, I do love Queek. I'm dead serious. If y'all get LAWhammer up to 5,000 subs, I will literally stop everything I'm doing. I will stop playing Baldur's Gate 3. I will stop doing whatever, and I will make and release the Queek video that y'all have been waiting like 4 years for. Anything that makes him stop playing Baldur's Gate 3 must be special.
Yeah. Oh my God. That game is dangerous. It's fucking dangerous.
Yeah. I've decided I'm playing it on PS5, which means I've still got a few weeks.
Yeah. Yeah. I cannot express enough how much amazing LAWhammer is. It is the ultimate expression of Warhammer Fantasy lore that is out right now. Outside,
thank you very much.
Like, it's amazing. If you've ever wanted to see a genuinely perfectly acted and canonical situation of a human walking up to a dwarf lord and calling him the wrong name after the dwarf just told him what his name was, it is fucking insane. Like, oh my God.
I think you haven't watched the next
Lord
episode.
Great Axe.
Oh, you haven't watched the next episode.
No, I'm watching what happens there. Oh my God. It's
a good one.
It is genuinely an amazing show. And Andy explains so much shit that he doesn't have to and probably shouldn't, but he does anyway. And it's amazing. Like, there's hijinks, but just a lot of incredible lore stuff. And I think probably this week, and if not next week at the latest, I'm going to be starting kind of like a rewatch through of the series to do like breakdown episodes as far as like with the community and stuff, which we talked about doing last week, but I'm going to be doing that because things have calmed down a little bit. I say as Shadows of Change comes out probably later this month.
That's just the way it goes, eh?
Yeah. And of course, check out the Rookery Publications as well. They just finished their most recent season of their interviews and stuff, but on top of the streams, which are awesome. Actually, why don't you talk about it for a second?
Yeah, okay. So over on Rookery Publications, that's a completely different YouTube thing you should go check out. We might even be a link sitting down there in the chat. Definitely if you're over on Twitch. We do streams about gaming in general. We do stuff about fiction. Oh, look at that. It's like magic. And we talk to Warhammer authors. We've had Andy Hall on, for example, from Total War, and we just discuss gaming for an hour every single week. We discuss cool stuff about how the things that we love get created. We also do tutorials about creating your own stuff, whether that's mapping or what I'm doing this Saturday, where I'm going to be doing a tutorial on how you can create your own locations for role-playing games in a concise way that ensures you get them done. That's going to be a lot of fun. Looking forward to that next Saturday.
And also LAWhammer and Rookery both have Patreons. Go support those.
Sure.
There's a lot of, like, unlike mine, he actually puts out stuff. So there is actually a ton of awesome material in there for role playing. Rookery has a lot for just like gaming in general and role play games and stuff. And Andy has a shit ton of articles that can vastly improve your Wolfrup experience. Vastly. Like, genuinely, I don't use everything he uses, but I use a lot of what he uses. And it helps, like, it's genuinely makes the game feel a lot more fun and just better. So anyway, that's enough of, how does Valrak put it? That's enough waffling.
Enough waffling.
So we're gonna go. Thank you all for watching. If you haven't already, please go check out Chaos Rising. Please support those guys. Go watch it. Give them a like, leave a comment, all that stuff. People. Yep. And it'd be awesome to see that. I don't know how they would do it as far as, like, it'd be nice to see it get picked up somehow, but at the very, who knows, maybe Games Workshop will look at it and go, oh, maybe
who knows?
Good. but at the very least, they deserve a lot of success for that.
Indeed. Lovely
So yeah,
seeing you all.
bye bye.
Until next time. Bye bye.